the shadow of the berserker lies across the earliest layers of Scandinavian memory, a shape that is never entirely distinct yet always unmistakably present. To search for its beginnings is to sift through the scattered fragments of language, myth, archaeology and lore that together preserve a picture of men who fought not merely as soldiers, but as beings touched by something beyond the ordinary. They are remembered as half man and half animal, exalted and feared, sometimes praised as divine instruments, and sometimes cursed as criminals. Their origins can be understood only by looking closely at the world that produced them, a society in which battle was both a practical necessity and a spiritual expression, in which the gods themselves fought in frenzy and demanded from their followers the same mixture of courage and madness. The linguistic trail begins with the Old Norse word berserker. Scholars still debate whether it means bear shirt or bear shirt, yet in either case the word points directly to a condition of strangeness and separation from ordinary men. A warrior who clothed himself in a bear's skin was no longer quite human, taking on the ferocity and strength of the animal. A warrior who went into battle without armour, exposing his flesh to blade and spear, declared himself protected by forces greater than metal. The ambiguity may not be accidental. It may have been part of the very identity, a word that invited double meanings because the men themselves lived in a double state, human yet beast, vulnerable yet untouchable. Language here reflects worldview, and the worldview of the early Norse was one in which a man could cross boundaries in body and in spirit. The cultural setting that produced these warriors was one in which violence was never far away. Scandinavia in the centuries leading up to the Viking Age was not a peaceful landscape of quiet farms. It was a mosaic of competing families, clans, and petty kings whose honour was defended in blood. Feuds could last generations, and a man's reputation in the hall was tied directly to his performance in combat. Warriors were praised in verse, their deeds repeated by poets at feasts, their strength immortalised in the memory of their kin. It is in this atmosphere that the berserker took shape, not as an outsider to society, but as an extreme expression of its deepest values. Where the ordinary warrior sought courage, the berserker became courage in its most uncontrollable form. Where the ordinary man sought to inspire fear, the berserker embodied fear itself. The earliest literary references are found in the sagas, though these texts were written centuries after the Viking Age they describe. Ynglinga Saga, composed by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, recounts that Odin's chosen men fought without armour, howling like animals and becoming stronger than human limits allowed. They bit their shields, their rage made them immune to fire and iron, and they slaughtered all before them. Later accounts echo the same pattern. The transformation into beasts, the madness of battle, the sense that ordinary weapons and wounds could not touch them. While these descriptions are surely coloured by myth and exaggeration, the consistency suggests they reflect a real tradition. Even if the powers were not supernatural, the reputation alone would have made them a terrifying presence in combat. The sagas preserve memory not of individuals but of an archetype, the berserker as a figure larger than life. The association with Odin is central to understanding their origin. Unlike Thor, who embodies straightforward strength, Odin is the god of frenzy, of wisdom gained through suffering, of transformation and trickery. He is the god who sacrificed himself upon the world tree to gain knowledge, who shapeshifted into birds and beasts, who inspired both poets and warriors with a madness that transcended reason. To follow Odin was to accept a path that defied convention, that embraced danger and sought knowledge in altered states. Berserkers were described as his chosen men, his champions, and their frenzied fighting can be seen as an earthly reflection of his divine qualities. The berserker was not merely a fighter, he was a vessel of Odin's power, the human form of divine frenzy unleashed on the battlefield. Archaeology supports at least part of this picture. The Torslunda plates from 7th century Sweden depict men in animal masks, one of them clearly in the guise of a bear or wolf. Rock carvings and small amulets show figures wearing animal skins in contexts that suggest ritual or martial significance. Burial finds sometimes include weapons alongside animal bones or skins, hinting at connections between warrior identity and animal symbolism. While we cannot say with certainty that every such image represents a berserker, they demonstrate that the fusion of man and beast in a fighting context was a recognised and powerful symbol in the centuries before the Viking Age. These warriors were not an invention of later saga writers, but part of a continuum of belief that extended deep into the prehistoric imagination of Scandinavia. The role they played within society seems to have been both honoured and feared. On one hand, kings and jarls may have kept berserkers as bodyguards or shock troops, men whose fury could decide battles and intimidate enemies. On the other hand, uncontrolled rage within the community was dangerous. Medieval law codes from Norway and Iceland refer to berserkers in terms of regulation and punishment. To go into a berserk frenzy in peacetime to threaten neighbours or disrupt assemblies was illegal and subject to fines or exile. These laws acknowledged the reality of berserkers while trying to contain them, showing that society valued their strength in war but feared their volatility at home. It was a precarious balance, tolerating the beast in battle but restraining it in peace. The mental state itself, known as Berserksganga, was remembered as a kind of trance. Accounts describe men becoming swollen with rage, howling, gnashing their teeth, their faces distorted, their strength multiplied. In this state they were said to be insensible to pain, oblivious to wounds, until the fury passed and they collapsed in weakness. Modern scholars have speculated about the causes. Some suggest intoxicating substances such as mushrooms or alcohol that could induce altered states. Others propose psychological conditions or techniques of self-induced trance akin to shamanic practices found among circumpolar peoples. Whatever the mechanism, the cultural meaning is clear. The berserker was one who stepped outside the ordinary human condition, channeling forces that frightened even his allies. This state was not merely a personal quirk, but a recognised and ritualised phenomenon, woven into the social and religious fabric of the time. Language itself shows how enduring the image became. To this day, the phrase, to go berserk, survives in English, stripped of its original religious context but still meaning uncontrollable rage. That persistence across 1,000 years testifies to the deep impression these warriors made on the collective imagination of Europe. Even medieval poets used the word as a metaphor for strength and fury, comparing ordinary heroes to berserkers when praising their courage. The berserker was both a literal figure in battle and a symbolic yardstick against which all other warriors were measured. Placing them within the broader European context reveals that they were not entirely unique. Roman authors described Celtic warriors who rushed into battle naked, seemingly indifferent to death. Germanic tribes were said to include fighters who bit their shields and fought with supernatural frenzy. The Norse berserker fits into this wider pattern of warrior ecstasy, though with its own distinct features rooted in Scandinavian religion and society. The difference lay in the specific link to Odin, in the ritual elements that seem to have been part of their practice, and in the particular cultural resonance they held for Norse communities. In this way, they were both part of a common Indo-European heritage and a uniquely Norse phenomenon. To speak of their origin, then, is to speak of many threads woven together. They were born from a language that blurred the line between bear and bear, from a culture that valued bravery to the point of madness, from a religion that sanctified frenzy as divine, from a society that both needed and feared their strength. They existed in memory long after their actual practices may have faded, preserved in sagas, poems, and proverbs. Their shadow falls across the earliest Norse traditions and stretches forward into later centuries, reminding us that the boundaries between man and beast, order and chaos, warrior and shaman, were never fixed but always shifting in the minds of those who lived in the Viking Age. As the story moves forward, the Berserkers will appear not only as figures of origin, but as actors in legend, participants in feasts and battles, protectors and threats within their own communities, and eventually as symbols reinterpreted by later generations. The shadow that first emerges in Norse memory will take on sharper outlines in the accounts of their rituals, their animal identities, and their strange battle frenzy that left no enemy untouched. The origins of the Berserkers cannot be separated from the spiritual landscape that shaped them, a world where the line between the human and the animal, the living and the spirit, was never clearly drawn. To understand why these warriors were seen as capable of entering trances and taking on the ferocity of beasts, one must begin with the shamanic practices that stretched across the northern reaches of Europe and into the circumpolar regions. These traditions were older than the Viking Age, older even than the earliest Norse sagas, rooted in a way of life that saw the forest and the tundra as alive with powers that could be accessed by those who knew how to bridge the worlds. The Berserker stood at the intersection of this spiritual practice and martial culture, a figure who carried the language of trance and possession into the field of battle. Among the Sami, the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, trance rituals were central to the role of the Noaidi, or shaman. Using drums, chanting, and altered states of consciousness, the Noaidi travelled in spirit to consult with beings beyond the human world, to heal, to find lost objects, or to influence the outcome of hunts. These practices involved symbolic transformation, often into animals such as bears, wolves, or birds. To put on a pelt, or to chant the song of a beast was not a mere performance. It was to become that animal in spirit, to take on its attributes and move through the world with its senses. This belief in transformation did not belong solely to the Sami. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that similar practices existed among Germanic and early Scandinavian peoples. When warriors in Norse sagas are described as howling like wolves or fighting with the strength of bears, these are not fanciful metaphors but echoes of a spiritual vocabulary that was deeply ingrained in the culture. The idea that a man could become more than human through trance or ritual is central to understanding the berserks, Ganga, the battle frenzy attributed to the Berserkers. This state was remembered as a condition where the warrior's body swelled with unnatural strength, where he lost awareness of pain, and where his senses were overtaken by animalistic rage. Modern interpreters have debated whether this might have been induced by intoxicants such as mushrooms, by alcohol, or by psychological techniques of self-hypnosis. Yet within the cultural framework of the Norse, it was understood as possession, as a state in which the warrior was overtaken by spirits, perhaps the very animal spirits whose skins or symbols he wore. This possession was not random madness, but a cultivated condition, part of a tradition that linked warriors to the spiritual practices of shamans. The trance state had multiple layers of meaning. On one level, it provided practical advantages in battle. A warrior who believed himself invulnerable, who ignored pain, and who terrified enemies with his howls and convulsions was an effective weapon. On another level, it confirmed the cultural belief that the gods and spirits intervened directly in human affairs. Odin himself was associated with altered states of consciousness. He was a god of Seda, a form of Norse sorcery that involved trance, chanting, and visions. To worship Odin was to accept that ecstasy, madness, and wisdom were closely connected. Berserkers, as his chosen men, were the embodiment of this principle. Their frenzy was not seen merely as a quirk of temperament, but as a divine gift, an extension of the god's own ecstatic power. To see a berserker fight was to witness Odin's frenzy made flesh. Animal symbolism was central to this transformation. The bear, the wolf, and in some traditions the boar, were the creatures most often linked to berserkers. Each carried different associations. The bear represented overwhelming strength and endurance, the ability to crush opponents with sheer physical might. The wolf represented ferocity, pack loyalty, and relentless pursuit, a predator that hunted with cunning as much as with savagery. The boar, less commonly mentioned but still present in iconography, represented stubbornness, ferocity, and the willingness to fight to the death even when mortally wounded. To wear the skin of one of these animals, to invoke it in ritual, or to embody its qualities in trance, was to step into a role that was both spiritual and martial. The berserker was not simply pretending to be an animal. He was believed to be possessed by its spirit, transformed in the moment of frenzy into something beyond the human. The archaeological record strengthens this interpretation. The Torslunda plates, produced in Sweden around the 7th century, depict figures wearing animal masks in ritual or combat settings. One plate shows a man with a bear mask striking another figure. Another depicts a dance-like scene in which animal-clad warriors seem to be moving in a ceremonial rhythm. These are not random decorations, but visual evidence of rituals that connected warriors to animal spirits. Burial finds in Scandinavia and beyond sometimes include animal skins or bones alongside weapons, suggesting that the identity of the warrior was tied to the animal even in death. These remains, though fragmentary, provide a material counterpart to the literary descriptions of berserkers, confirming that the fusion of human and animal was more than a metaphor. It was enacted in ritual, in costume, in burial, and in the imagination of the people. The shamanic roots of the berserkers also explain their ambiguous position within society. Shamans in many cultures were respected but also feared. They mediated between the human and spirit worlds, a role that gave them power but also made them dangerous, liminal figures who did not fully belong to ordinary life. The berserkers shared this liminality. In war, they were invaluable, their frenzy turning battles and terrifying enemies. In peace, they were unsettling, their potential for uncontrolled violence threatening the order of the community. Law codes from medieval Norway condemned berserk fury outside of battle as unlawful, recognizing that the same trance that made them useful in war made them disruptive in peace. This duality reflects the shamanic heritage, figures who straddled boundaries, who brought power from beyond but had to be carefully managed within society. The trance itself may have been prepared through ritual practices that paralleled shamanic techniques. Accounts suggest that berserkers worked themselves into frenzy before battle, biting their shields, chanting and howling. These actions are reminiscent of ritual induction into altered states, where rhythm, sound and repetitive movement can shift consciousness. Shield biting in particular may have had symbolic significance, an act of aggression that blurred the line between human and beast, as though the warrior were literally devouring his own defences in preparation for becoming something more than human. Once the frenzy was reached, the berserker entered the battlefield in a state that to his comrades and enemies alike appeared supernatural. The effect would have been terrifying. A man who ignored wounds, who attacked with animal ferocity, who seemed invulnerable and unstoppable. Whether or not the trance truly conferred supernatural power, its psychological impact was undeniable. This shamanic dimension also helps explain the enduring fascination with berserkers in literature. Saga writers did not describe them simply as skilled fighters, but as transformed beings, figures who carried the aura of the uncanny. The stories of them howling, gnashing their teeth, swelling with strength, and collapsing after the fury passed all reflect a cultural understanding of trance and possession. These details are consistent with shamanic descriptions from other cultures, where the practitioner enters an altered state, channels otherworldly power, and then falls into exhaustion once the spirit departs. The sagas, though written in Christianized Iceland centuries after the Viking Age, preserve memories of a tradition that was far older and deeply rooted in the spiritual life of the Norse world. The animal within was not a metaphor to the people of the time, but a lived reality. The bear was revered in northern cultures, often associated with spirits and with rituals of hunting and warfare. To kill a bear was to engage with a powerful spirit, and to wear its skin was to take on its essence. Wolves likewise occupied a liminal place in Norse cosmology, feared as predators but also admired for their strength and loyalty within the pack. the wolf was connected to Odin, whose own wolves, Geri and Friki, sat at his side. To become a wolf in spirit was to draw directly from the god's own companions. The boar, sacred to Freya and Freyja, carried associations of fertility and protection, as well as ferocity, a complex symbol that may explain why some warriors identified with it. In all cases, the animal within was not an abstract concept, but a real force, a spirit that could be called upon, embodied, and unleashed. The persistence of these ideas into the Viking Age shows how deeply shamanic roots were woven into the culture. Even as Scandinavian society developed complex laws, trade networks, and political structures, the old traditions of trance and animal possession remained part of its spiritual fabric. Berserkers were not relics of a primitive past, but active participants in a society that valued both rational organization and ecstatic experience. Their roots in shamanism explain why they seemed to carry powers that ordinary men did not possess, why they were feared as much as admired, and why their memory endured long after their actual practices had begun to fade. As Norse communities expanded through raiding, trading, and settlement across Europe, the image of the berserker carried with it these shamanic associations. Outsiders who encountered them saw not only fierce warriors, but men who fought as though possessed. Men who seemed less like soldiers and more like embodiments of some primal force. This perception contributed to the reputation of Vikings as terrifying raiders, a reputation amplified by the presence of berserkers within their ranks. The trance, the spirits, the animal within, these were not private experiences but public performances that shaped how Norse warriors were seen by both their own people and by the rest of Europe. What began as shamanic practice among the peoples of the north thus flowed into the identity of the berserker, shaping them into warriors who were more than human in the eyes of their contemporaries. Their animal spirits, their trances, their rituals of transformation, all mark them as inheritors of a tradition that was as much spiritual as it was martial. The berserkers cannot be understood without recognizing these roots, for it was from this soil of shamanic practice that their frenzy grew, and from these animal spirits that their shadow fell across the battlefields of the Viking Age. The image of the berserker is never complete without the animals that defined him. From the earliest references in saga literature and poetry, to the scattered traces in archaeological finds, the berserker was consistently described through the forms of beasts. He was the man who took on the fury of the bear, the cunning of the wolf, or the stubborn ferocity of the boar. These were not casual associations. They were totems, identities rooted in spiritual and martial traditions that carried deep significance for the people of Scandinavia. To grasp the nature of the berserker, one must understand how these animals were perceived, how their qualities were absorbed into the warrior's role, and why they became the chosen emblems of transformation. The bear was the most enduring symbol of raw power in the northern world. Across the circumpolar regions from Siberia to North America, the bear occupied a sacred position in folklore and ritual. It was both feared and venerated, seen as an almost human creature whose strength could dominate the forest. In Scandinavia, this reverence was no different. Archaeological sites reveal bear skulls placed with care in graves, evidence that the animal was not treated as mere prey but as a spiritual presence. Norse mythology itself reflected this reverence. The god Thor was sometimes associated with bear-like qualities of strength and endurance, though the berserker's bear identity was more closely tied to Odin, whose warriors took on the bear's rage as an expression of divine fury. The term berserker, understood by many as bear shirt, encapsulates this connection. To wear the hide of a bear was not simply to don clothing, but to assume its spirit, to cloak oneself in its power and ferocity. Descriptions of berserkers in battle often emphasize their invulnerability, their seeming indifference to wounds, and their overwhelming strength. These are precisely the qualities attributed to the bear, an animal known for enduring wounds that would kill lesser creatures and for fighting with relentless power even when injured. A warrior who fought in the spirit of the bear was imagined as indomitable, difficult to bring down, capable of smashing through shields and crushing opponents with sheer might. The bear was not only a symbol of individual strength, but of solitary ferocity, a creature that could fight alone against many. In this sense, the bear berserker represented the terrifying image of the lone fighter who needed no comrades to prevail, a figure who stood apart from the ordinary ranks of men. The wolf carried different associations, though no less potent. Unlike the bear, which embodied solitary strength, the wolf symbolized cunning, loyalty to the pack, and the ruthless pursuit of prey. In Norse cosmology, wolves held a prominent place. The monstrous wolves Skirl and Hati chased the sun and moon across the sky, destined to devour them at Ragnarok. Odin himself was accompanied by two wolves, Geri and Freki, who sat by his side and devoured the food placed before him while he consumed only wine. These images place the wolf at the heart of Norse imagination, both as a destructive force and as a divine companion. To be a wolf warrior was to align oneself with this duality, the predator that threatens cosmic order and the companion of the god who oversees it. Wolf berserkers were often associated with bands of warriors rather than solitary fighters. Some scholars have connected them to the Ulfhednar, literally wolf coats, described in saga sources as Odin's chosen warriors who fought with ferocity and wore wolf skins. Unlike the solitary bear berserker, the wolf warrior was imagined as part of a group, a pack that could strike with coordinated fury. This distinction may reflect different social roles. Bear berserkers could be personal champions or bodyguards of kings, while wolf warriors may have formed elite units that fought together in raiding parties or served as the shock troops of an army. The symbolism of the wolf emphasizes cooperation as much as ferocity, making the wolf berserkers embodiments of both loyalty and terror. The behavior attributed to berserkers also fits the wolf imagery. Howling before battle, gnashing teeth, and biting shields echo the behavior of wolves preparing for the hunt. The transformation into wolf form was not always literal, but to those who witnessed the frenzy, it would have seemed that these men had truly become predators, their humanity subsumed by the spirit of the animal. Enemies facing such warriors would not only be confronted with physical violence, but with the unsettling sense that they were fighting against something other than men, against a pack of wolves unleashed upon them. The psychological effect of this identity was as powerful as the physical force it conveyed. The boar, while less frequently mentioned, was no less significant. In Norse mythology, the boar was sacred to Freyr and Freya, gods associated with fertility, prosperity and protection. Freya's golden bristled boar, Gullinbursti, was a symbol of light and abundance, while Freya's boar, Hildisvini, was associated with battle. The boar thus carried both peaceful and warlike connotations, a duality that made it a potent symbol for warriors. In battle, the boar was known for its ferocity and its refusal to retreat. Hunters feared the boar as a dangerous opponent, capable of charging through spears and inflicting fatal wounds even in death. To embody the boar was to take on this relentless determination, to fight without hesitation until the end. There are references in medieval texts to warriors compared to boars, their shields decorated with boar imagery, and their courage likened to the stubborn ferocity of the animal. Some helmets from the migration period bear boar crests, further evidence that the boar was seen as a protective and empowering emblem for warriors. While the bear and wolf may have been more prominent in berserker identity, the boar provided a complementary model, one that emphasized steadfastness and fearless resistance. A boar berserker may not have been as numerous as his bear or wolf counterpart, but his image still resonated within the wider spectrum of Norse warrior culture. The totemic identities of the berserkers were not symbolic in the modern sense of abstract metaphor. For the Norse, these animals were real presences, spiritual beings that could possess, guide, and transform those who invoked them. To wear the skin of a bear or a wolf was not mere costume, but ritual, a way of crossing into the animal's spirit and bringing it into battle. The transformation was understood as literal in the moment of frenzy, when the warrior's howls, convulsions, and superhuman strength revealed that he was no longer himself but the animal within. This worldview reflects the shamanic roots of the tradition, in which the human body could serve as a vessel for spirits, and the boundaries between human and animal could be traversed through trance. The practical effects of these identities were significant. On the battlefield, a warrior who believed himself to be a bear or a wolf would fight with a confidence that transcended ordinary fear. His enemies, seeing him clad in skins, howling and charging, would be struck by terror before the combat even began. The berserker's reputation for invulnerability and unstoppable rage amplified this effect, creating a psychological weapon as effective as any sword. In societies where battle was as much about morale as about physical destruction, the presence of berserkers could decide outcomes simply by breaking the will of opponents. The totemic identities were not ornamental but central to the function of these warriors. Literary sources also reflect the enduring association of berserkers with these animals. In skaldic poetry, heroes were often compared to bears or wolves, their ferocity likened to the beasts of the forest. Saga accounts describe berserkers transforming into animal-like states, biting and howling, impervious to fire and steel. These descriptions, though written centuries later, preserve the memory of a tradition in which the animal was inseparable from the warrior. The metaphors were rooted in lived belief, in a cultural framework where to be a wolf or a bear in spirit was a real condition with real consequences. The social perception of these identities was complex. On one hand, the bear, wolf, and boar were admired for their strength, ferocity, and courage. Warriors who embodied them were celebrated as champions and feared as unstoppable foes. On the other hand, these animals also carried associations of danger and wildness. Bears and wolves were threats to human communities, predators that had to be hunted and controlled. The boar was both a source of food and a dangerous adversary. To embody these animals was to take on their ambivalence, to become both protector and threat, honoured and feared. This tension is reflected in the laws that sought to restrain berserkers in peacetime. Their animal identities made them powerful in battle, but disruptive in society, forces that had to be carefully managed. The persistence of these totemic identities also shows how deeply they were woven into the cultural imagination. Even after the decline of berserkers as a social reality, the imagery of the bear, wolf and boar endured in literature, folklore and art. Later, medieval romances and legends continued to use these animals as symbols of ferocity and courage. The association between berserkers and animal transformation persisted in popular imagination, eventually feeding into modern portrayals of werewolves and other shapeshifters. The totemic identities thus extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping the way later generations understood both warriors and the boundaries between human and beast. To speak of berserkers is to speak of animals as much as men. The bear gave them strength and solitary power. The wolf gave them pack loyalty and ferocity. The boar gave them stubborn courage and fearlessness. These animals were not chosen at random but represented qualities essential to survival and victory in the harsh world of early Scandinavia. They were the totems through which warriors transcended the human, the identities that allowed them to fight as beings more than men. The berserker without his animal was unimaginable, for it was in the fusion of man and beast that his true power lay. From these animal identities, the story moves forward into the rituals that brought the frenzy to life, into the shield biting, the howling, the convulsions that turned belief into performance and performance into terror. The totems provided the framework, but it was in the ritual madness of the Berserksganger that the transformation became complete, a condition that carried these warriors from the world of men into the realm of spirits. The heart of the Berserker tradition is found in the mysterious condition remembered in Old Norse sources as Berserksganga, the Berserk's trance or fury. Without this state, the Berserker is only a warrior dressed in animal skins, perhaps fierce, but not extraordinary. With it, he becomes something entirely other, a figure who terrified enemies and unsettled allies, who seemed invulnerable to weapons and unbound by ordinary human limits. The Berserksganger is what transformed a man into the image that endured through saga and poetry. Shield-biting, howling, swollen with unnatural strength, oblivious to wounds, and collapsing only when the fury at last receded. The descriptions are vivid, but also enigmatic, raising questions about what this state was, how it was induced and how it was understood by those who witnessed it. Accounts of berserkers in saga literature often begin with their preparation before battle. They are described as entering into a frenzy through physical acts such as biting the rims of their shields until their teeth splintered, pounding weapons against wood, or letting out unearthly howls that unsettled all who heard them. These behaviours served both symbolic and practical purposes. Symbolically, they mark the transition from ordinary man to possessed warrior, a ritual performance that declared that the frenzy was about to begin. Practically, they whipped the body into heightened arousal, increasing adrenaline, building tension, and creating the psychological state necessary for what followed. What the sagas describe is not a sudden switch, but a process of induction, a carefully cultivated path into altered consciousness. Once the Berserksganger was reached, the warrior was said to fight with impossible ferocity. He would ignore pain, continue striking even when bloodied, and overwhelm opponents through sheer determination. Saga descriptions emphasize that fire and iron seemed to have no effect on him, as though his skin could not be pierced or burned. This invulnerability, whether literal or not, was part of the cultural perception of the state. To enemies facing such a fighter, it would have appeared that nothing could stop him. To allies, it was proof that Odin's power was present in their midst. The condition lasted until the frenzy burned itself out, after which the warrior collapsed into weakness, drained of strength, and left vulnerable. This cycle of rage, followed by exhaustion, matches patterns seen in trance traditions across cultures, where the body channels extraordinary energy for a time before inevitably succumbing to depletion. Modern attempts to explain Berserksganger have ranged from pharmacological theories to psychological interpretations. Some have proposed that hallucinogenic mushrooms, particularly Amanita muscaria, were used to induce the state. The bright red mushroom with white spots is known to cause delirium, convulsions, and sensations of invulnerability, effects that match parts of the berserk description. Others suggest alcohol or mixtures of intoxicants could have played a role, producing both heightened aggression and insensitivity to pain. Psychological explanations emphasize the possibility of self-induced trance states, achieved through ritual chanting, rhythmic movement, and intense focus. Such practices are well documented in shamanic traditions, where altered states of consciousness are cultivated without external substances. It is likely that the Berserksganger was not the result of one single method, but of a combination of techniques, varying across time and place. What mattered to contemporaries was not the mechanism but the outcome, the transformation of an ordinary man into a figure of terrifying fury. The Berserksganger was not interpreted as madness in the modern clinical sense. To the Norse it was possession, a state in which the warrior was overtaken by divine or spiritual forces. Odin, the god of ecstasy, was the one most often invoked. His own association with altered states made him the natural patron of berserkers, and his warriors were seen as embodying his power in their frenzy. The state was therefore not shameful or pathological, but exalted, at least in the right context. To enter Berserksganger in battle was to channel the divine. To enter it in peacetime, by contrast, was dangerous and unlawful, for it unleashed forces that had no place in the orderly rhythms of society. This dual perception explains why berserkers could be both celebrated and outlawed, their fury both admired and feared. Descriptions of the frenzy include details that suggest more than simple rage. Faces contorted, bodies swelled as though filled with unnatural energy, teeth gnashed uncontrollably, and voices rose in howls that sounded inhuman. These accounts match cross-cultural patterns of possession states, where individuals take on characteristics of spirits or animals. Shield biting is particularly telling, an act that appears in multiple saga accounts. By biting their shields, berserkers enacted an image of devouring, as though consuming their own defences in preparation for violence. It was a symbolic act of transformation, breaking the barrier between man and beast. To those who witnessed it, the act was unsettling, a visible sign that the warrior before them was no longer entirely human. The fear inspired by the Berserksganga cannot be underestimated. In societies where warfare often depended on morale, the appearance of a warrior in trance could destabilize entire groups of enemies. Ordinary fighters who saw a man seemingly immune to wounds, howling like an animal, and charging with unrelenting force could easily lose their will to resist. The berserkers' reputation magnified this effect. Tales of their frenzy spread across communities, ensuring that even the rumour of their presence on a battlefield could cause panic. This psychological weapon was as valuable as any blade, making berserkers prized as shock troops despite the risks of their uncontrollable rage. Law codes from Norway and Iceland specifically address the Berserksgang, confirming its recognised existence. The Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code, prohibited men from going berserk in peacetime, prescribing penalties for those who did. The law's very existence shows that berserk fury was not a literary invention, but a real phenomenon, disruptive enough to require legal restraint. These laws distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable uses of the trance, underscoring its dual role as both a social asset and a threat. The Berserksganga was thus not only a personal state, but a communal concern, something that could destabilize society if not carefully managed. The sagas preserve stories of berserkers who misused their fury, turning it against neighbours or using it to intimidate others. These figures are often cast as villains, eventually brought down by heroes who outwit or overpower them. Such stories reflect the ambivalence with which Berserksganga was viewed. It was a source of awe when used in service of the community, but a source of danger when turned inward. The collapse into weakness after the frenzy also provided narrative opportunities, for saga heroes sometimes exploited this vulnerability to defeat berserkers once their fury had burned out. These tales capture the cultural tension, admiration for the berserker's power, coupled with awareness of its limits and dangers. The enigmatic nature of the Berserksganga lies in its mixture of the physical, psychological and spiritual. It was at once a physiological state of heightened adrenaline, a psychological trance induced through ritual, and a spiritual possession understood as divine. To separate these elements would be to miss the way they were fused in the worldview of the Norse. For them, the gods were present in the body, the spirits moved through the mind, and the animal within could be called forth through ritual. The Berserksganga was the living embodiment of this worldview, the point where belief, body and battle converged. The condition also explains the enduring fascination with berserkers in later centuries. Long after the Viking Age, medieval writers continue to record stories of men who fought in uncontrollable fury. Christian scribes often recast the Berserksganga as diabolical possession, a reinterpretation that demonized what had once been seen as divine. Yet even in this altered form, the phenomenon remained recognizable. The idea of men who entered trances, who fought with inhuman strength, who collapsed in exhaustion, persisted in memory because it had been so deeply rooted in the cultural experience of earlier generations. The Berserksganga was therefore not a simple curiosity but the defining feature of the berserker identity. Without it, the animal skins and the totemic identities would have been incomplete. With it, they became the fearsome figures that haunted the imagination of Europe. The ritual madness was the engine that drove the legend, the condition that turned belief into reality, terror into weapon, and man into something more than man. From here, the path leads naturally into how these warriors were remembered in the sagas, where their frenzy is woven into narrative and myth, their image preserved not only as fighters, but as archetypes of unrestrained fury, in a culture that both revered and feared them. The memory of the berserker survives most vividly in the sagas, those sprawling prose narratives written in Iceland from the 12th through the 14th centuries. Though composed long after the Viking Age, they preserve within their episodes the echoes of an earlier time when berserkers walked among men, both feared and celebrated. These texts, shaped by Christian scribes yet filled with pre-Christian lore, stand as the richest literary source for understanding how berserkers were remembered, how their image was adapted, and how their archetype came to embody both the glory and the terror of unrestrained warrior power. The sagas do not present berserkers in a single, unified light. They appear as champions, villains, outlaws, and symbols of chaos, their presence shifting depending on the needs of the story. Yet through all these variations, a consistent set of traits remains: frenzy, strength, animalistic transformation, and the tension between admiration and fear. One of the earliest saga references to berserkers comes in the Ynglinga saga, where Snorri Sturluson describes Odin's warriors. They fought without armour, immune to wounds, biting their shields and howling like animals. This brief but powerful description set the tone for later depictions, establishing the berserker as a figure whose fury was both supernatural and terrifying. Other sagas elaborated on these qualities, weaving them into the fabric of heroic and legendary tales. The berserker became a recurring presence, sometimes as the protagonist's fiercest enemy, sometimes as a test of strength, sometimes as a loyal but dangerous ally. The variety of roles reflects the complex place the berserker held in cultural imagination: indispensable, yet uncontrollable, admired, yet mistrusted. In Egil's saga, one of the most famous of the Icelandic sagas, berserkers appear as opponents who threaten social order. The saga recounts the tale of two berserker brothers who challenged Egil and his brother Skallagrim. These figures are portrayed not as noble warriors, but as disruptive troublemakers who use their frenzy to intimidate others and force unwanted marriages. Egil defeats them, asserting the superiority of controlled, heroic strength over uncontrolled madness. This episode reveals one of the common functions of berserkers in saga literature: to serve as foils against which the hero's virtues can be measured. By overcoming them, the protagonist demonstrates both physical power and moral authority, proving himself not only strong but just. Yet berserkers were not always villains. In some sagas, they appear as elite warriors in the service of kings. Hrolf Kraki's saga describes berserkers among the legendary king's champions, men whose fury in battle secured his reign. Here the frenzy is not disruptive but essential, an asset that ensures victory and loyalty. These berserkers are celebrated for their courage, their terrifying presence on the battlefield seen as a gift to their lord. This duality, sometimes villains, sometimes protectors, highlights the ambivalent nature of berserkers in cultural memory. They could serve society when contained within loyalty to a king, but they could also threaten it when their fury escaped the boundaries of law and custom. The Vatnsdæla saga provides another glimpse into this ambivalence. In it, berserkers are described as dangerous men whose uncontrollable rage made them feared by their neighbours. They were often depicted as overbearing bullies who disrupted the peace, leading to conflicts that had to be resolved by heroes or by the community. Such portrayals reflect the anxieties of a society that valued order and stability, but could not ignore the allure of unrestrained warrior strength. The saga authors, writing in a Christianized Iceland where law and arbitration had become central, often cast berserkers as relics of a wilder past, figures whose behaviour clashed with the emerging values of restraint and legal resolution. The literary function of berserkers also extended into the legendary sagas, which preserved older heroic traditions. In these tales, berserkers sometimes appear as supernatural opponents, their frenzy magnified into monstrous form. Heroes who faced them were tested not only in strength but in courage, for to confront a berserker was to confront a force of nature, Such episodes reinforced the idea that berserkers embodied more than physical power. They were archetypes of chaos and ferocity, challenges that demanded extraordinary resolve. In overcoming them, heroes affirmed their place as masters of both the physical and moral worlds. Shield-biting, howling, and animalistic transformation recur across these narratives. The sagas describe berserkers biting the rims of their shields, gnashing their teeth, and roaring like beasts as they entered frenzy. These details were not invented for literary effect, but reflected long-standing traditions about berserker behaviour. By preserving these elements, the saga authors ensured that the archetype of the berserker remained consistent even as their stories adapted to new contexts. Readers and listeners would have recognised these traits as markers of the berserker identity, signalling immediately that the figure being described was not an ordinary man but one possessed by fury. The collapse after frenzy also appears in saga accounts. Berserkers, once their fury had burned out, were said to fall into weakness, unable to move until the trance passed. This detail provided narrative opportunities for heroes to defeat them, striking when their power was gone. It also reflected cultural memory of the Berserksganga as a real phenomenon, a cycle of frenzy and exhaustion. The sagas preserved this aspect not merely as storytelling convenience, but as recognition of how the condition was understood. By including it, the authors tied their tales to a wider tradition of belief about what it meant to be a berserker. The way berserkers are depicted in the sagas also reflects the tension between pagan and Christian worldviews. In pre-Christian contexts, the frenzy of the berserker was associated with Odin, seen as divine possession. By the time the sagas were written, however, Christianity had reshaped cultural perspectives. Frenzy that was once sacred could now be framed as diabolical. Some saga authors portrayed berserkers as agents of chaos, their possession interpreted as unnatural or even demonic. This reinterpretation did not erase the older image, but added new layers of meaning. Readers in medieval Iceland could understand berserkers both as echoes of a pagan past and as cautionary figures who embodied uncontrolled violence. Despite this ambivalence, the sagas also show fascination with berserkers. They appear repeatedly, their presence too compelling to be omitted. Heroes needed worthy opponents, and few figures provided a more dramatic challenge than a berserker in full frenzy. Communities needed cautionary tales, and berserkers supplied vivid examples of the dangers of unrestrained aggression. Kings needed loyal champions, and berserkers in their service provided models of terrifying loyalty. Through all these roles, the berserker archetype remained central to the saga imagination, a figure who embodied both the allure and the peril of warrior ecstasy. The literary preservation of berserkers also ensured their survival in cultural memory long after the actual practice may have faded. Even if berserkers as a distinct group had disappeared by the time the sagas were written, the stories kept their image alive, shaping how later generations understood the Viking Age. The sagas did not invent berserkers, but transmitted them, weaving them into narratives that reflected both historical memory and contemporary concerns. The result was a figure at once ancient and enduring, a savage archetype that continued to haunt the imagination. The saga depictions also influenced later European literature. As translations and retellings spread beyond Iceland, the image of the berserker entered the wider medieval imagination. They became symbols of northern ferocity, exotic figures who embodied the wildness of the Viking past. This transmission ensured that the berserker archetype would not remain confined to Scandinavia, but would become part of the broader European understanding of barbarian warriors. The sagas thus not only preserved berserkers for their own audiences, but exported them into the wider literary tradition. The richness of berserker portrayals in the sagas lies in their variety. They could be villains, protectors, monsters, or metaphors. They could serve as cautionary tales or as heroic challenges. They could embody the old pagan world or be reinterpreted through Christian lenses. Yet through all these variations, they remained recognizable, defined by frenzy, animal transformation, and ambivalent power. The sagas did not reduce them to a single role, but allowed them to occupy many, ensuring that their archetype would remain flexible and enduring. In this way, the sagas accomplished more than simple storytelling. They preserved a cultural memory of berserkers that might otherwise have been lost. They fixed in writing traits that had lived in oral tradition for centuries, giving future generations access to the archetype. They shaped how we today understand berserkers, for much of what is known about them comes through these literary lenses. The sagas are not transparent windows onto the Viking Age, but they are indispensable records of how berserkers were remembered, feared, admired, and reimagined. From these literary portraits, the narrative can move deeper into the communal spaces where berserkers lived and were feared, the halls where they feasted, the kinship ties that bound them, and the uneasy role they played in societies that valued their strength, yet struggled with their wildness. The figure of the berserker cannot be understood apart from the communities in which he lived. He was not only an individual possessed by frenzy, but part of a wider brotherhood of warriors bound by oaths, shared feasts, and the complex web of kinship that defined early Scandinavian society. To imagine him only as a solitary figure howling on the battlefield is to miss the social framework that gave his identity meaning. Like all warriors of the Viking Age, the berserker drew strength from his ties to companions and to lords, from the ritual gatherings in halls where mead flowed and oaths were sworn, from the sense of belonging to a group that was both family and fighting band. The warrior's brotherhood was the setting in which the berserker's frenzy was both cultivated and controlled, where his animal nature was given place within the human order of kin and hall. In early Scandinavian culture, kinship was the foundation of social life. A man's identity was inseparable from his family, his clan, and the alliances his lineage maintained. Feuds between families could last for generations, demanding loyalty and revenge from descendants who had never met the original participants. Honour was collective, and an insult to one member was an insult to all. Warriors were therefore never simply individuals fighting for themselves. They fought as representatives of their families, as defenders of ancestral honour. Berserkers, with their extraordinary ferocity, were both assets and dangers in this system. Their strength could secure victory in feud or raid, but their lack of restraint could also bring disaster, sparking conflicts that engulfed entire communities. Their place within kinship networks was therefore precarious, balanced between loyalty and the risk of uncontrollable violence. Beyond blood ties, warriors forged bonds of brotherhood through oaths. In the sagas and in historical accounts, oath-taking ceremonies are frequently mentioned, rituals in which men pledged loyalty to one another or to a leader. These oaths were sacred, often sworn before gods, and breaking them was among the greatest dishonours. Berserkers were not outside this system. Indeed, their reputation for loyalty in battle made them valuable as oath-bound companions. Some sources describe bands of berserkers who fought together, bound by shared pledges. The wolf warriors, the Ulfhednar in particular, seem to have been organised as groups, their pack identity reinforced by the symbolic weight of the wolf itself. Oaths gave structure to their fury, channeling it toward collective goals and binding it to the service of kings or chieftains. The feasting hall was the heart of this brotherhood. Archaeological excavations across Scandinavia have revealed large hall structures, some capable of holding hundreds of people, where lords entertained their retainers, kin, and allies. These halls were not merely places for eating and drinking. They were the centres of social and political life, where decisions were made, disputes settled, and reputations built. For warriors, the hall was the place where deeds were celebrated by skalds, where honour was recognised, and where the bonds of loyalty were renewed through shared drink. The mead cup passed from hand to hand was more than refreshment. It was a ritual object that bound the community together, sealing oaths and affirming unity. For berserkers, the hall was both a stage and a test. Their ferocity made them valuable to a lord, but their unpredictability made them dangerous in the intimate space of feasting. Saga accounts often describe berserkers disrupting feasts, challenging others to duels, or intimidating guests. Such behaviour reflected the tension between their animal nature and the civilized order of the hall. Yet the same sagas also describe kings and jarls surrounding themselves with berserker champions, seating them in prominent places as symbols of strength. The hall thus became the place where berserkers were both integrated and restrained, honoured for their loyalty and feared for their volatility. The rituals of feasting often emphasised the transformation of ordinary men into warriors. Drinking was not only social but symbolic, preparing men for battle, loosening inhibitions and affirming courage. Songs sung by skalds recounted the deeds of ancestors and heroes, reinforcing ideals of bravery and ferocity. Berserkers, already marked by their trance and animal identities, fit naturally into this environment. Their frenzy could be stoked by drink and song, their reputation magnified by the tales told in the hall. In this way, the Brotherhood of Warriors was not only practical but ritual, a continuous reinforcement of identity through performance and celebration. The relationship between warriors and their lords was also central. Kings and chieftains depended on retainers to secure their power, and berserkers, with their fearsome reputation, could serve as bodyguards and shock troops. Some saga accounts describe kings keeping berserkers close, rewarding them with gifts, seats of honour, and a share of plunder. These relationships were cemented in the hall, where gift-giving rituals took place. The lord would present weapons, rings, or land to his retainers, and in return they pledged loyalty. Berserkers were no exception to this system. Their fury was harnessed by patronage, their animal power bound to the service of their lord through the bonds of gift and oath. The Brotherhood of Warriors was also reinforced through ritual combat and competition. Duels, known as holmgang, were common features of saga life, often fought to settle disputes or prove honour. Berserkers frequently appear as challengers in these contests, using their frenzy to intimidate opponents. Sometimes they triumphed, demonstrating their superiority. Sometimes they were defeated, their collapse after frenzy exploited by clever heroes. Either outcome reinforced the social function of the duel, to test strength, resolve disputes, and reaffirm the values of courage and honour. The presence of berserkers in these duels highlights their role not only in war, but in the social rituals that structured Norse life. The image of berserkers as members of warrior bands also appears in legendary sagas. Stories tell of groups of 12 berserkers serving a king, fighting together as a unit, their frenzy magnified by their collective identity. These groups echo the structure of warrior retinues described in historical sources, where loyalty to a leader bound men into tight-knit brotherhoods. The number 12 may have symbolic significance, but the core idea is clear. Berserkers were not isolated individuals, but often part of groups defined by oaths and service. Their ferocity was amplified by collective action, making them even more formidable. Kinship, oaths, and feasting created a framework that allowed berserkers to exist within society. Without these structures, their frenzy would have been intolerable. Within them, it became an asset. The hall was the place where this balance was maintained, where loyalty was affirmed, where ferocity was contained by ritual, and where the bonds of brotherhood ensured that even the wildest warriors could find a place. The sagas, by depicting berserkers in these contexts, preserve the memory of how they fit into the larger fabric of Norse life, not only as terrifying fighters, but as members of communities bound by shared values. Yet these bonds were always fragile. A berserker who turned his fury against his own kin, who violated oaths, or who disrupted the peace of the hall could not be tolerated. Saga accounts of berserkers as villains often centre on such breaches, showing them as men who failed to respect the bonds of brotherhood and therefore had to be destroyed. These stories reinforce the importance of kinship and loyalty, using the figure of the berserker to illustrate the dangers of violating them. The Brotherhood of Warriors was not only a source of strength, but a standard by which men were judged. and berserkers who failed that standard were cast as threats to be eliminated. The Warriors Brotherhood thus reveals another dimension of the berserker archetype. He was not only a solitary figure possessed by frenzy, but part of a network of relationships that gave his identity meaning. His animal nature was balanced by the human bonds of kinship and oath. His frenzy was contained by the rituals of the hall. His loyalty was secured by the gifts and patronage of lords. In this way, the berserker was woven into the fabric of society even as he strained against its limits. His story is not only one of madness and battle, but of belonging and loyalty, of feasting and oaths, of the fragile balance between wildness and order. From the halls where warriors feasted and swore loyalty, the path leads naturally to the weapons they carried and the paradox of their armour, for the berserker's identity was shaped as much by his equipment, or lack of it, as by his bonds of kinship. The next step in understanding their story is to explore the arms that defined them and the strange invulnerability that was said to protect them in place of armour. The image of the berserker on the battlefield is inseparable from the weapons he carried, and the armour he refused to wear. In a world where warriors prized mail, shields and helmets as the difference between life and death, the berserker stood apart as a paradox. He fought with the same swords and axes as other men, but his reputation claimed he did not need armour at all. He was said to stride naked into battle, or clad only in animal skins, impervious to iron and fire. This refusal of conventional protection became one of the most striking aspects of the berserker's identity, a feature that bewildered enemies and impressed allies. To fight without armour was not merely a matter of recklessness, but a declaration, a ritual statement that the berserker was shielded by forces greater than steel. The sagas and poems that describe berserkers often emphasize this lack of armour. In Ynglinga saga, Odin's warriors are said to have gone into battle without mail, biting their shields and howling like beasts, their frenzy making them invulnerable. Other accounts repeat the same theme: berserkers who ignored wounds, who could not be pierced by weapons, who seemed to walk through fire unharmed. Whether these claims were literal belief or exaggerated reputation, they reflect a consistent cultural perception. To be a berserker was to be more than human, a man whose protection came from divine possession or spiritual transformation. Armour was unnecessary because the body itself had become untouchable. The nakedness of the berserker, whether literal or symbolic, served multiple functions. On a psychological level, it terrified opponents. A man who charged without armour signalled that he feared nothing, not even death. Enemies facing such a fighter would have seen recklessness as proof of invulnerability. On a ritual level, nakedness may have been part of the transformation, shedding ordinary protection as part of becoming the animal or spirit that possessed the warrior. To fight bare-chested or in skins was to display the rejection of human limitations, a visible sign that the berserker had crossed into another state. The paradox was that this vulnerability was itself a form of strength, turning what should have been weakness into the ultimate display of confidence and divine favour. Yet berserkers did not fight empty-handed. Their weapons were the same as those of their contemporaries, and in some cases their reputations were tied to the skill with which they wielded them. The sword, the axe and the spear were the primary arms of Viking Age warriors, each carrying symbolic weight as well as practical use. The sword, often elaborately decorated and passed down through generations, represented honour and lineage. To wield a sword was to connect oneself to ancestors, to embody continuity. The axe, more common and often associated with farmers as well as warriors, carried a rougher, more brutal image. The spear, favoured in earlier Germanic tradition and associated with Odin himself, symbolised divine authority. Berserkers could carry any of these, but saga accounts often describe them using axes or swords, weapons suited to close frenzied combat. Shields, too, appear in berserker descriptions, though often in ways that highlight their transformation rather than their defence. The shield was not only a barrier but a tool in ritual, bitten and gnashed by berserkers as they prepared for frenzy. This act of biting may have symbolized the devouring of protection, the rejection of ordinary defense in favor of animal ferocity. Some sagas describe berserkers breaking their shields in fury, as if their rage overflowed beyond the need for defense. Yet in battle, shields were practical tools, and it is unlikely that berserkers entirely abandoned them. The paradox is again evident. The berserker rejected armour, yet still used the weapons and shields of his peers, embodying both the familiar and the uncanny. The question of whether berserkers literally fought naked has long been debated. Archaeological evidence for warriors fighting without armour is difficult to prove, though some burial finds suggest that mail was relatively rare, owned only by the wealthiest. Many ordinary fighters would have fought with little or no armour simply because they could not afford it. The berserker's distinction, then, may not have been literal nakedness, but ritualized rejection. Where others wore helmets or mail when possible, the berserker was remembered for going without, not because he lacked resources, but because he embraced invulnerability. The memory of nakedness may have been symbolic exaggeration, emphasizing the contrast between ordinary fighters and those possessed by frenzy. The belief in invulnerability was not unique to Scandinavia. Across Europe, warrior traditions included figures thought to be impervious to weapons. Roman accounts of Celtic warriors describe fighters who entered battle unclothed, their bodies painted or tattooed, displaying fearlessness and divine protection. Germanic tribes were said to include shield biters and mad fighters whose frenzy made them impervious. The Norse berserker fits into this wider pattern, but with its own distinctive twist: the connection to Odin and to trance. The berserker's invulnerability was not only physical but spiritual, rooted in possession by the god of ecstasy. This gave the paradox of naked invulnerability its cultural depth, transforming a tactical behaviour into a religious statement. The saga literature preserves anecdotes that highlight this paradox. Berserkers are described as charging ahead of armies, breaking enemy lines through sheer ferocity. Their lack of armour is emphasised not as weakness, but as part of their terrifying power. Heroes who faced them had to overcome both their physical strength and their aura of invulnerability. Sometimes this aura proved deceptive. Saga heroes often defeated berserkers by exploiting their collapse after frenzy, showing that even the invulnerable could be brought down. These tales reinforced the dual image of the berserker, unstoppable in fury, yet vulnerable once the divine possession ebbed. Weapons themselves carried symbolic associations that deepened the paradox. A berserker's sword or axe could become legendary, remembered in poetry, and passed down in sagas as part of his identity. The act of fighting without armour magnified the significance of the weapon, for if the body was unprotected, the blade became the extension of divine rage. The clash of steel in berserker hands was not ordinary combat, but the eruption of Odin's power into the human world. To face such a warrior was to confront not just man and weapon, but god and spirit fused in frenzy. The paradox of invulnerability also had social implications. In a culture where gift-giving was central, armour was among the most prestigious items a lord could bestow. To give a man mail or a helmet was to honour him and secure his loyalty. A berserker who rejected armour was therefore rejecting a key symbol of social order. This rejection could be seen as arrogance, a declaration that he needed nothing from his lord but his own divine protection. At the same time, it could elevate him, marking him as set apart, chosen by Odin rather than by human patronage. The paradox was not only personal but political, shaping how berserkers fit, or fail to fit, within the structures of Norse society. The nakedness of the berserker also resonates with ritual traditions outside of war. In many cultures, nudity in ritual symbolizes purity, vulnerability, or transformation. To strip away clothing is to strip away ordinary identity, preparing the body for contact with the divine. The berserker's rejection of armour can be read in this light, as a ritual stripping away of the human to make room for the animal spirit or the god. The battlefield thus became an extension of ritual space, a place where the berserker enacted transformation through both frenzy and nakedness. The paradox of invulnerability was not an accidental feature, but a deliberate expression of spiritual identity. The terror this image inspired cannot be underestimated. Enemies who saw men charging without armour, their bodies painted with blood or covered in animal skins, their mouths gnashing shields, would have felt they were facing something beyond human. The psychological impact of this display was as important as its physical reality. To believe an enemy invulnerable is to risk defeat before the fight begins. The berserker's paradox, then, was a weapon in itself, shaping the perception of all who encountered him. The legacy of this paradox extended beyond the Viking Age. Later medieval writers continue to describe berserkers as impervious to weapons, interpreting their frenzy through Christian frameworks. Some called it demonic possession, others dismissed it as exaggeration, but the core image remained. The naked warrior immune to steel endured as part of the archetype, influencing later tales of enchanted fighters, of werewolves, and of heroes who fought with divine protection. The paradox of vulnerability turned into invulnerability proved too powerful to fade, embedding itself in cultural memory. The berserker's weapons and armour, or their absence, thus reveal much about his identity. He was armed like other men but fought unlike them, rejecting the protection they valued. His paradox lay not only in his body but in his role, at once human and more than human, vulnerable in appearance but invulnerable in reputation. The sagas preserved this image because it captured the essence of the berserker archetype, a figure who embodied contradiction and transformed it into power. From here, the story moves outward from the individual warrior's arms and armour to the wider stage of Viking raids, where berserkers carried their frenzy across the seas, spreading their terror through villages and kingdoms far beyond Scandinavia. The Viking Age was defined not only by the settlement of new lands and the forging of kingdoms, but by the raids that carried Norse warriors far from their homelands. These raids, sudden and devastating, reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Europe, leaving memories of burning monasteries, shattered armies, and fleets of longships appearing without warning on distant shores. Within this larger phenomenon, the berserkers played a role that magnified both the fear and the effectiveness of these attacks. Their frenzy, their reputation for invulnerability, and their terrifying presence made them natural instruments of shock, warriors whose appearance on foreign fields amplified the terror of the Norse incursions. To trace their role in Viking raids is to see how the archetype of the berserker moved from the halls of Scandinavia into the consciousness of Europe at large. The first major recorded raid of the Viking Age took place in 793, when Norsemen attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. Contemporary chronicles describe the event as a sudden calamity, a divine punishment that struck terror into the Christian world. While no source from that moment specifically mentions berserkers, later memories of Viking raiders often included descriptions of frenzied warriors whose savagery seemed beyond the human. To the monks and villagers who witnessed the onslaught, the distinction between ordinary Norse fighters and berserkers may have blurred. All appeared terrifying, but those who charged into battle with howls, indifferent to wounds, would have left the deepest impression. Over time, the image of berserkers and the reality of raiders fused in European imagination, so that the Viking threat was remembered in part through the lens of berserk fury. As raids expanded across the British Isles, the role of berserkers became clearer. Saga literature, composed centuries later, recalls Viking bands in which berserkers fought at the forefront. Their task was not subtle. They were shock troops, breaking enemy lines, shattering morale and creating panic. In battles where surprise and psychological dominance mattered as much as numbers, such warriors were invaluable. A small force of berserkers could make a larger army break and run, spreading chaos that allowed the rest of the raiding band to plunder unopposed. Their frenzy, described as terrifying even to their comrades, became a weapon aimed at the hearts of enemies who had never seen such fighters before. The expansion of raids into Ireland and the Frankish kingdoms further spread the reputation of berserkers. Irish annals record the ferocity of Viking attacks, describing raiders who burned churches, looted treasures, and fought with reckless courage. Though the chroniclers do not always single out berserkers, later saga traditions place frenzied fighters in these contexts. The very features that defined berserkers, howling, shield-biting, indifference to pain, appear in descriptions of Viking cruelty, suggesting that European observers perceived these behaviours as integral to the Norse threat. To the Christian chroniclers, unable or unwilling to interpret such states as divine possession, the frenzy of berserkers may have seemed demonic, further amplifying the terror of their raids. In the Frankish Empire, the Carolingian annals describe repeated encounters with Viking raiders along the rivers Seine, Loire and Rhine. Frankish armies struggled to contain the fast-moving fleets that struck deep into the heart of the realm. Reports emphasise the savagery of the attackers, their fearlessness, and their apparent disregard for death. These are precisely the qualities attributed to berserkers in Norse tradition. While the Frankish chroniclers did not use the word berserker, their descriptions align with the archetype. For Frankish soldiers, facing warriors who seemed impervious to fear or pain must have been deeply unsettling. The reputation of the berserker grew not only in Scandinavia, but in the reports of terrified Europeans who survived the raids. The presence of berserkers in raiding parties also reflected their role within Norse society. They were not always king's champions in great armies, but often members of smaller bands bound by oaths and seeking wealth and fame. Raiding offered the perfect stage for their frenzy, where terror could secure victory without prolonged battle. The sudden strike, the overwhelming assault, the collapse of resistance, these were the moments where berserkers thrived. Their identity as warriors possessed by animal spirits fit seamlessly into the chaotic violence of raids, where shock and awe mattered more than discipline. The berserker's howl carried across foreign shores, announcing not only the arrival of Norsemen, but the eruption of a force beyond the ordinary. The saga literature preserves stories of raids where berserkers played key roles. In Egil's saga, berserkers are portrayed as part of raiding bands who use their frenzy to intimidate and overpower opponents. Though often cast as antagonists, their behaviour reflects the real strategies of raiding parties, where psychological dominance was crucial. The sagas also tell of berserkers in legendary raids, crossing seas to challenge kings and seize treasures. These tales, though embellished, preserve the cultural memory of berserkers as raiders, men whose frenzy extended beyond Scandinavian battlefields into the wider world. The reputation of berserkers spread quickly among those who suffered Viking attacks. Monks, chroniclers, and villagers alike came to associate Norse raiders with uncontrollable savagery. To them, the entire Norse host could appear berserk, their fury indistinguishable from madness. This perception magnified the terror of raids, making resistance seem hopeless. In this way, the berserker archetype became not only a feature of Norse identity, but a label applied by outsiders, a shorthand for the incomprehensible violence of Viking incursions. The Norse may have seen berserkers as chosen warriors of Odin, but Europeans saw them as monsters unleashed upon Christendom. The strategic value of berserkers in raids extended beyond terror. Their willingness to lead charges made them natural vanguard fighters. In river battles, when longships rammed into opposing vessels or beached on hostile shores, berserkers were likely among the first to leap into combat. Their frenzy ensured momentum at the critical moment of engagement, when hesitation could mean defeat. By throwing themselves into the fight with abandon, they created openings for their comrades, setting the tone for the battle. The paradox of their invulnerability reinforced this role. Whether or not they truly were immune to weapons, their belief in it made them fearless, and their enemies' belief in it made them panic. As Viking raids turned into settlements, the role of berserkers shifted but did not vanish. In places like Dublin, York and Normandy, Where Norse communities established lasting footholds, berserkers continued to serve as champions and enforcers. Their frenzy was no less effective in defending a town or intimidating local populations than it was in raiding monasteries. The archetype persisted, adapted to new contexts. Saga accounts of settlers in Ireland and England sometimes include berserkers as part of their retinues, showing that even in more stable communities, the memory of frenzied warriors remained. The European response to berserkers was one of fascination as well as fear. Chroniclers often moralised about Viking savagery, framing it as punishment for sin or as evidence of pagan wickedness. Berserkers, when described, were interpreted as possessed by demons, their howls and convulsions fitting into Christian categories of unnatural states. This reinterpretation ensured that the berserker image was preserved in European texts, even if stripped of its Norse religious meaning. The archetype survived not only in saga literature but in the writings of those who suffered the raids, filtered through the lens of Christian interpretation. The reputation of berserkers also influenced the way European armies perceived Norse threats. Fear of uncontrollable fighters could undermine morale, making defenders hesitate or flee before combat even began. This psychological dimension was as valuable as physical power. Viking leaders likely recognized this, using berserkers as part of their strategy to magnify terror. The appearance of frenzied warriors, combined with the sudden arrival of longships and the speed of attack, created a cumulative effect that overwhelmed defenders. Berserkers were thus not incidental participants in raids but central to their success, amplifying the shock that defined the Viking way of war. The long-term impact of berserkers in raids was the fusion of their image with that of Vikings as a whole. To many Europeans, all Norsemen seemed berserk, their raids characterized by frenzy and savagery. The distinction between ordinary warriors and berserkers blurred in memory, leaving a legacy in which the very word Viking evoked the image of uncontrollable fury. This fusion helped preserve the archetype, ensuring that berserkers were not forgotten even after their specific practices faded. The terror they inspired was too great to be erased, too deeply embedded in the memories of those who faced them. From the shattered monasteries of England to the burning towns of Francia, from the river battles of Ireland to the settlements that grew into cities, berserkers carried their frenzy across Europe, leaving behind stories that shaped both Norse and foreign memory. Their role in raids was both practical and symbolic. Practical in their function as shock troops and vanguard fighters, symbolic in the way their frenzy embodied the terror of the Viking Age itself. From these raids, the narrative turns to another sphere of their influence, where berserkers did not only fight for themselves or their bands, but entered the service of kings, becoming both protectors and executioners, men whose frenzy was bound directly to the authority of rulers who needed their fearsome loyalty. When we think of berserkers, it is easy to picture them as outlaws on the fringes of society, unpredictable men who lived only for battle and whose frenzy disrupted the ordinary rhythms of life. Yet the historical and literary record reveals another dimension. These warriors, so feared for their uncontrollable rage, were also brought into the very heart of power. Kings and chieftains of the Norse world, always in need of protection and in search of men whose loyalty could be guaranteed in the most dangerous circumstances, employed berserkers as personal bodyguards and, in some cases, as executioners. The paradox of entrusting the order of royal courts to men defined by frenzy highlights both the utility and the danger of berserkers within the political structures of early Scandinavia. The position of a bodyguard in Norse society carried immense significance. A king's authority rested not only on his lineage and his charisma, but on his ability to protect himself from rivals. Feuds, ambushes, and assassinations were constant threats. To survive, rulers surrounded themselves with retinues of elite warriors known as Herd. These men were bound to their lord by oath, gift-giving, and loyalty, their presence both a defence and a symbol of power. Within this context, berserkers fit naturally. Their reputation for invulnerability and their terrifying presence on the battlefield made them ideal deterrents to enemies. A king who employed berserkers at his side declared to all that his protection came not only from human strength, but from divine frenzy. Saga literature preserves multiple references to berserkers in royal service. In Rolf Krake's saga, berserkers appear as part of the legendary king's band of champions, men whose ferocity in battle ensured his dominance. They were not portrayed as disruptive outlaws, but as loyal retainers, feared by enemies and admired by allies. Their frenzy, far from being a liability, was celebrated as an asset, a weapon that secured the king's reign. Other sagas echo the same theme, describing berserkers as royal guards who stood close to the throne, ready to unleash their fury against anyone who threatened their lord. These accounts suggest that berserkers were not merely tolerated on the margins of society, but deliberately integrated into the highest levels of political authority. The role of berserkers as executioners reveals another dimension of their service. Kings and chieftains often relied on them to carry out acts of violence that were necessary but also socially dangerous. Execution was not only a legal function but a symbolic act of enforcing royal authority. By delegating this role to berserkers, rulers ensured that justice was carried out with terrifying efficiency, while also channeling the stigma of bloodshed onto men already associated with frenzy. Saga accounts describe berserkers beheading enemies, punishing traitors, and carrying out violent tasks that reinforced the king's power. Their reputation for uncontrollable rage made them ideally suited for such roles, for no one doubted their willingness to spill blood when commanded. The political use of berserkers was not without risks. Their loyalty was often tied to personal bonds of gift and oath, but their nature made them volatile. Some sagas recount instances where berserkers turned against their lords or used their fury to intimidate even allies. In Egil's saga, berserkers who abused their strength were cast as villains, using their position to coerce and disrupt rather than to protect. These stories reflect the underlying anxiety of rulers who employed such men. While their service could secure power, their rebellion could bring ruin. The king who welcomed berserkers into his hall had to balance honour and fear, rewarding them richly while keeping them under control. Archaeological evidence also suggests that berserkers were associated with royal courts. Depictions on the Torslunda plates, showing animal-masked warriors alongside figures of authority, may represent ceremonial roles linked to kingship. Rock carvings and burial finds indicate that animal warrior identities were connected to elite status, not merely marginal outlaws. If berserkers wore their animal skins in ritual and battle, their presence in the king's retinue would have reinforced the aura of divine authority surrounding the ruler. In this sense, the berserker was not only a guard but a symbol, a visible manifestation of the ruler's connection to Odin and to the powers of the other world. The paradox of entrusting kingship to berserkers lies in the tension between chaos and order. Kingship was meant to embody stability, law, and the protection of society. Berserkers, by contrast, embodied frenzy, unpredictability, and violence. Yet it was precisely this paradox that made them powerful symbols. A king who could command berserkers demonstrated mastery over forces that ordinary men could not control. By binding them through oath and gift, he showed that his authority extended even to the wildest of warriors. The berserker at the king's side was therefore both weapon and emblem, both servant and symbol of dominion. The literary motif of berserkers as executioners also reflects cultural memory of their liminal position. Executioners in many societies were figures both necessary and stigmatized, men who enforced justice but were marked by blood. Berserkers, already feared for their frenzy, fit this role seamlessly. Their violence could be harnessed for the good of the community, while their social otherness absorbed the taint of killing. By placing executions in the hands of berserkers, kings both utilized and contained their ferocity, turning it into a tool of governance. Despite their service, berserkers were never entirely trusted. Saga authors often portrayed them with ambivalence, acknowledging their loyalty but warning of their volatility. The Christian scribes who wrote these texts also reframed berserker frenzy through moral categories, sometimes presenting them as dangerous men whose service to kings was a sign of worldly power rather than divine blessing. Yet the persistence of their presence in these narratives underscores how important they were to the memory of kingship. The image of a ruler without berserkers at his side seemed incomplete, as though true power required not only wisdom and wealth, but also the mastery of frenzied warriors. The integration of berserkers into royal service also influenced how outsiders perceived Scandinavian rulers. European chroniclers who encountered Norse kings often remarked on the ferocity of their followers. To see men howling in frenzy at the command of their lord was to witness a spectacle of terror that reinforced the king's power. The reputation of berserkers thus extended beyond Scandinavia, shaping the image of Norse kings in the wider European imagination. Their presence magnified the aura of fear that surrounded Viking leaders, making them appear not only as military commanders but as masters of supernatural forces. The eventual decline of berserkers in royal service reflects broader cultural shifts. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the use of berserkers became less acceptable. Their frenzy, once seen as divine, was increasingly viewed as diabolical or unlawful. Law codes condemned berserks, Ganga in peacetime, and rulers sought to distance themselves from practices associated with pagan possession. Yet the memory of berserkers as royal bodyguards and executioners endured in saga literature, preserved as part of the archetype of kingship in the Viking Age. Even as the practice faded, the idea remained, shaping how later generations understood both the berserker and the ruler who commanded him. The service of berserkers to kings reveals the complexity of their identity. They were not merely marginal figures but central to the exercise of power. Their frenzy, so feared in society, became a weapon of authority when bound to a ruler. Their role as bodyguards and executioners placed them at the intersection of chaos and order, embodying both the danger and the necessity of violence in a world where kingship was fragile and constantly contested. To understand the berserker fully is to see him not only in the wilds of battle, but in the halls of kings, standing guard by the throne, axe in hand, ready to unleash frenzy at the command of his lord. From the courts of kings, where berserkers served as protectors and enforcers, the story turns outward again to society at large, where admiration for their service was tempered by fear, and where laws and customs sought to restrain them even as rulers relied on their strength. In the world of the Norse, the figure of the berserker occupied a place both honoured and feared, celebrated for his unmatched ferocity in war, and dreaded for the same qualities when they erupted outside the battlefield. No warrior in early Scandinavian society embodied such extremes of admiration and anxiety. To many, berserkers seemed touched by divine favour, chosen by Odin to channel otherworldly strength, and to fight with an intensity beyond human measure. Yet to others, they were dangerous, unpredictable men whose frenzy could destroy peace as easily as it secured victory. The laws, customs, and stories that survive from the Viking Age reflect this ambivalence, showing how communities struggled to balance the value of berserkers with the constant threat they posed. At the heart of the problem was the dual nature of berserkers' frenzy. In battle, berserk's Ganga was an advantage, transforming men into shock troops who could break enemy lines and instill fear before swords even clashed. Their apparent invulnerability, their howls, their shield biting, and their disregard for pain made them ideal instruments of violence. But in times of peace, that same frenzy threatened to destabilize communities bound by fragile agreements and delicate balances of honor. The sagas are filled with tales of berserkers who disrupted feasts, challenged men to duels, or turned their fury against their own neighbours. These stories are not only literary inventions, but reflections of a real cultural anxiety. How to contain men whose power could not be controlled by ordinary means? Scandinavian law codes addressed this problem directly. The Icelandic Gragas, written down in the 12th and 13th centuries but preserving earlier traditions, explicitly outlawed the practice of going berserk in peacetime. Men who entered frenzy outside of battle were considered a threat to social order, and penalties were prescribed against them. This legal recognition demonstrates that berserkers were not merely fictional figures, but participants in real life whose behaviour needed regulation. The laws did not deny their existence. Rather, they sought to draw a line between acceptable and unacceptable use of their fury. In war, Berserksganga could be tolerated or even celebrated. In peace, it was a crime. Norwegian and other Scandinavian laws carried similar provisions, condemning berserkers who disturbed society. The language used often placed them alongside outlaws, men excluded from the protection of law because they posed too great a danger. In a society where law was based on consensus and arbitration, rather than centralized enforcement, such measures reveal the depth of unease surrounding berserkers. If their frenzy could not be controlled by oath or custom, then it had to be restricted by declaring it outside the bounds of acceptable behaviour. These laws embody the tension between awe at their power and terror at their unpredictability. Saga literature reinforces this tension. In Egil's saga, berserkers are depicted as troublemakers who abuse their strength to coerce others, demanding marriages or property through intimidation. The heroes who defeat them are celebrated not only for physical strength, but for restoring social balance. The berserker, in this narrative, represents disorder, a force that must be contained for society to function. Yet in other sagas, the same type of figure appears as a valued champion in the service of a king. The contrast reflects the dual perception of berserkers. When aligned with legitimate authority, they were assets. When acting independently, they were dangers. Feasting halls, central to social life, often became stages where this tension played out. Berserkers, fueled by drink and song, might fall into frenzy, disrupting what was meant to be a ritual of unity. Saga authors describe scenes where berserkers turned feasts into battlegrounds, forcing hosts to respond with violence or humiliation. Such episodes highlight the unease that accompanied their presence even in communal spaces. Yet the same halls also honoured them, seating them near kings or celebrating their deeds in poetry. The feasting hall thus embodied the broader social paradox, a place where berserkers were both included and feared, both welcomed and watched with caution. The ambivalence extended into folklore and belief. To some, berserkers were touched by divine favour, their invulnerability proof of Odin's protection. To others, they seemed possessed by malevolent forces, their frenzy indistinguishable from madness or diabolical possession. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the latter interpretation grew stronger. What had once been celebrated as divine ecstasy came to be condemned as devilish rage. This shift is reflected in the way later saga writers portrayed berserkers, often casting them as villains or as figures of the pagan past. Yet even in these Christianized accounts, a lingering fascination remains. The berserker is never entirely dismissed, for his image was too deeply rooted in cultural memory. The awe inspired by berserkers is evident in the way their names and reputations were preserved. Saga genealogies often include mention of berserker ancestors, suggesting that despite their volatility, they were remembered with pride. To claim descent from a berserker was to claim a heritage of strength and fearlessness, even if society also recognized the danger of such traits. The ambivalence was thus embedded in memory itself, pride and fear, admiration and caution, bound together in the legacy of the berserker. Archaeological evidence further supports the dual perception. Images on picture stones and small metal amulets depict warriors with animal attributes, perhaps representing berserkers. These images often place them in ritual or ceremonial contexts, suggesting respect and veneration. Yet burial practices reveal a different story. Unlike great kings or wealthy chieftains, berserkers do not appear to have been buried with extraordinary honours, at least not in ways that stand out archaeologically. Their memory was preserved in image and story more than in monumental graves, as if society admired their power but hesitated to celebrate them in the same way as other elites. The laws and customs surrounding berserkers thus reveal a society caught between awe and terror. They were indispensable in war, embodying the ferocity that secured victories and defended rulers. But they were intolerable in peace, where their frenzy threatened the fragile balance of community. Law codes, saga stories, and folklore all reflect this ambivalence, preserving the memory of men who stood on the boundary between hero and outlaw, divine champion and dangerous madman. This tension shaped not only the perception of berserkers in their own time, but also their enduring legacy. Later centuries remembered them not only as wild warriors, but as symbols of the dangers of unrestrained aggression. They became cautionary figures as much as heroic ones, embodying the line between order and chaos. Their presence in lore and story ensured that they would not be forgotten, even as the practice itself declined. From these legal and social frameworks, the narrative moves naturally into the cultural memory preserved in poetry and myth, where berserkers lived not only as historical figures but as symbols woven into the skaldic tradition, their frenzy immortalized in verse that celebrated both gods and men. The memory of the berserker did not survive only through the judgments of law or the tales preserved in saga prose. It also lived in the poetry of the skalds, those composers who shaped the cultural imagination of the Viking Age with their intricate verses. In a society that prized the spoken word as much as the sword, poetry was both entertainment and history, a medium through which kings were praised, ancestors honoured, and myths remembered. Within this oral tradition, the berserker found a place, not as a marginal figure but as a powerful symbol whose frenzy resonated with the divine realm and the heroic ideal alike. Skaldic poetry, with its dense kennings and complex structures, often compared warriors to animals, storms, or natural forces, metaphors that fit the berserker perfectly. The wolf and the bear, already central to berserker identity, appeared frequently in kennings for fighters. A man who slew his enemies might be called a feeder of wolves, emphasizing both his violence and the carrion left in his wake. To liken a warrior to a bear was to highlight his strength and ferocity. These poetic devices ensured that even when a specific berserker was not mentioned, the essence of berserk fury infused the language of praise. The skalds elevated the berserker archetype into a poetic standard, part of the vocabulary of heroism. The Ynglinga saga, which incorporates earlier poetic traditions, explicitly links berserkers to Odin. The verse preserved there describes Odin's men as going without armour, biting their shields and fighting with the strength of bears and wolves. This poetic depiction not only records the phenomenon of berserkers, but frames it as divine. To fight in frenzy was to embody the god's own ecstasy, a union of human and divine will. Skalds who invoked such imagery reinforced the connection between kings, warriors, and the sacred. A king with berserkers in his retinue could be praised not only for military might, but for embodying Odin's power through his champions. Mythological texts preserved in the Poetic Edda also echo the berserker image. The god Odin himself was associated with battle frenzy, shape-shifting, and possession. His ability to send his spirit forth, to inspire warriors, and to control animals all parallel the traits of berserkers. In myth, warriors blessed by Odin often fought with superhuman strength, indifferent to wounds and filled with unstoppable rage. The berserker was thus not merely a human figure but a reflection of divine archetypes. To invoke berserk fury in poetry was to place the warrior on a continuum with the gods, to suggest that in his madness he touched the divine realm. The figure of the werewolf, Orlfhedin, occupies a special place in both myth and poetry. In heroic lays such as the Volsunga saga, Sigmund and Sinfjotli Donwolf skins that give them the power of transformation, allowing them to fight with inhuman ferocity. These stories echo the Berserker tradition, presenting animal transformation as both blessing and curse. The poetry surrounding these figures reinforces the idea that the Berserker's frenzy was not only a human condition, but part of a mythic pattern, one where warriors crossed the boundary between man and beast. The poetic echoes of such tales ensured that the archetype of the animal warrior remained central in cultural imagination. Skalds also preserved memory of specific berserkers through praise poems. Kings who employed them could have their champions celebrated in verse, their deeds immortalized alongside those of their lords. Such poems, though often focused on the ruler, necessarily included the warriors who made his victories possible. To describe berserkers charging into battle, impervious to wounds, was to enhance the glory of the king they served. The poetry thus not only celebrated the berserker, but integrated him into the larger narrative of royal legitimacy. His frenzy was a poetic resource, as much as a battlefield reality, an image that magnified the power of those who commanded him. The Christian scribes who later recorded these poems often added their own interpretations, but the underlying admiration for berserk fury persisted. Even when berserkers were recast as villains in saga prose, the poetry preserved a more ambivalent tone, one that acknowledged the awe they inspired. The kennings and verses continued to associate warriors with animals and frenzy, ensuring that the poetic tradition carried forward the archetype even as social attitudes shifted. The mythological reflections of berserker identity also shaped later medieval interpretations. The association with Odin, with shape-shifting, and with animal possession made berserkers natural figures of fascination in a Christianized world where such traits could be reinterpreted as supernatural or diabolical. Poets who drew on older traditions still employed the imagery of animal transformation and frenzy, even as they reframed it in new theological contexts. The continuity of the poetic language ensured that the berserker remained recognizable across centuries, his image embedded in the structures of verse. The endurance of berserk imagery and poetry reflects its resonance with fundamental human concerns. The berserker embodied the tension between control and chaos, civilization and wildness, human and animal, mortal and divine. Poets seized upon this tension because it provided rich metaphors for war, kingship, and fate. In a society where poetry was central to memory, the berserker's frenzy became more than a historical phenomenon. It became a symbol woven into the very fabric of myth and verse, ensuring that his echo would be heard long after the warriors themselves had vanished. In the skaldic tradition, words had power not only to praise but to shape reality. To describe a man as wolf-like or invulnerable was not mere metaphor, but an invocation of qualities believed to be real. The poetry thus reinforced the identity of berserkers, both in their own eyes and in the eyes of others. A warrior celebrated in verse as a bear in battle might be more likely to embrace that identity, to act it out in combat. The feedback between poetry and practice deepened the role of berserkers in society, embedding their frenzy in cultural performance as well as lived reality. These poetic echoes remind us that the berserker was never only a warrior. He was also an image, a symbol, a metaphor, a myth. His frenzy reverberated through verse as much as through the clash of weapons. To understand his legacy, we must listen not only to the laws that condemned him, or the sagas that feared him, but to the songs that celebrated him, the verses that placed him alongside gods and heroes. The berserker lived as much in words as in deeds, as much in poetry as in battle. From the skaldic songs and mythological reflections, the path of the story moves deeper into the cult of Odin and the religious dimensions of berserker identity. For the frenzy was not only praised in poetry, but sanctified in ritual, a manifestation of devotion to the god of ecstasy and battle. The berserker's identity was not only a matter of battle technique or social role. At its core lay a profound religious dimension. To fight in frenzy, To enter Berserk's Ganga, to abandon ordinary human restraints, was understood not as mere madness, but as possession by forces beyond the human realm. Among the Norse, no god stood closer to this experience than Odin, the All-Father, the god of war, death, poetry, and ecstasy. Berserkers were remembered not simply as fighters, but as chosen instruments of Odin, men who bore his mark and manifested his power in their howls, their shield-biting, and their disregard for wounds. The shadow of Odin lay over every act of the Berserker, shaping their self-understanding and the way they were perceived by others. Odin's connection to battle was unlike that of Thor, who embodied straightforward strength and thunderous blows. Odin's power was subtler, rooted in cunning, in ecstasy, and in the ability to manipulate the mind as well as the sword. He was the god who inspired poetry, who mastered runes, who travelled in disguise, who practiced Seder, a form of shamanic sorcery often viewed with suspicion. His warriors reflected these traits. Berserkers were not merely strong, they fought as if possessed, as if their minds had been altered by trance or magic. This mirrored Odin's own mastery of altered states, his willingness to blur boundaries between the human and the divine, the masculine and the feminine, the warrior and the sorcerer. To channel berserk fury was to partake in the mysteries of Odin, to embody his ecstatic nature. The link between Odin and berserkers is explicit in early sources. The Ynglinga saga describes Odin's men as fighting without armour, raging like dogs or wolves, biting their shields and killing without mercy. Their invulnerability to fire and iron is attributed to the god's power. This account does not treat berserkers as strange outcasts, but as the very companions of Odin himself, chosen for their ability to channel his force. To fight as a berserker was therefore not simply to be ferocious, but to be sacred, to participate in the cult of a god who valued frenzy as a path to victory and as a form of devotion. Ritual practices surrounding Odin reinforce this connection. Animal transformation was central to both Odin and his warriors. The god himself could take the form of animals, sending his spirit forth as a bird or beast. His companions, the ravens Hugin and Munin, symbolized thought and memory, while his wolves Geri and Friki embodied his hunger for battle. Berserkers mirrored these associations by adopting animal identities, donning wolf or bear skins and howling as if possessed. These acts were not mere theatrics, but ritual performances that linked them to Odin's own nature. By wearing the wolf's skin, the Ulfhedin became part of Odin's pack. By fighting in frenzy, he enacted the god's ecstasy on the battlefield. Sacrifice also tied berserkers to Odin. The god was himself a sacrificer and a sacrificed. He hanged himself on Yggdrasil, pierced by a spear in order to gain wisdom and runes. Warriors who dedicated their fury to him mirrored this act of self-offering. In battle, to give one's life in frenzy was to sacrifice oneself to Odin, to join the ranks of the Einherjar in Valhalla. Berserkers, who fought without fear of wounds and often without armour, embodied this willingness to sacrifice. Their disregard for safety was not only tactical, but religious, a demonstration that they had already offered themselves to the god of the slain. Every howl, every shield bite, every mad charge was a ritual act of devotion. The cult of Odin included practices that blurred the line between warrior and shaman, and here too the berserkers fit. Seder, the ecstatic sorcery associated with Odin, involved trance, chanting, and altered states of consciousness. Though often associated with women and viewed with suspicion when practiced by men, it was nonetheless part of Odin's domain. The Berserk's Ganga can be seen as a martial parallel to Seder, a warrior's trance achieved through ritualized behavior. Both involved crossing boundaries, abandoning ordinary identity, and entering states of possession. In this sense, berserkers were not only fighters, but ritual practitioners, their frenzy a form of lived cultic experience. The integration of berserkers into cult practice is also suggested by archaeological evidence. Images on amulets and carvings depict animal warriors, often in contexts that appear ritual rather than strictly martial. The famous Torslunda plates from Öland, for example, show a one-eyed figure, likely Odin, standing beside an armed dancer wearing a wolf or bear mask. The scene suggests ritual performance, perhaps initiation into warrior identity, with the god overseeing the transformation. Such images support the idea that berserkers were not simply spontaneous madmen, but participants in ceremonies that connected them to Odin's cult. Their frenzy was cultivated, learned, and sanctified through ritual. The presence of berserkers in royal service, as described in sagas, further underscores their religious dimension. Kingship in Norse society was often sacral, linked to the gods and legitimized through ritual. To keep berserkers close was to signal divine favour, to demonstrate that Odin's chosen warriors stood at the ruler's side. Their very presence in the hall or on the battlefield was a form of cultic display, a living reminder of the king's connection to Odin. This religious symbolism amplified their political role, making them not only protectors but embodiments of divine sanction. Christian writers who later describe berserkers often recast their devotion as diabolical. What had once been seen as possession by Odin was reinterpreted as demonic frenzy. Yet the core traits remained recognizable: the association with altered states, with animal transformation, with ritual madness. All continued to define the berserker archetype. This reinterpretation highlights the depth of the religious dimension. Even when Christianity sought to suppress or demonize the cult of Odin, it could not erase the memory of berserkers as religious warriors. Their image endured precisely because it was rooted in sacred practice as much as in martial behaviour. The devotion of berserkers to Odin also explains their endurance in myth and poetry. As Christianity spread, many aspects of pagan religion were forgotten or transformed. Yet Odin himself remained vivid in memory, and his warriors remained part of the stories told in sagas and poems. The berserker archetype persisted because it was bound to the god who embodied both wisdom and frenzy, both poetry and war. To remember berserkers was to remember Odin, and to remember Odin was to preserve the essence of berserk fury. The shadow of Odin over the berserkers thus reveals the deeper meaning of their existence. They were not simply mad warriors, but religious figures, men who enacted the god's ecstasy in flesh and blood. Their frenzy was a form of worship, their animal skins a ritual costume, their disregard for wounds a sacrificial offering. To fight as a berserker was to live in the presence of Odin, to carry his power into battle, and to embody his mysteries before the eyes of friend and foe alike. From this religious devotion, the story turns toward the decline of the berserkers, for as Christianity spread and Odin's cult was suppressed, the sacred foundation of berserk frenzy crumbled, and the figures once honoured as the gods chosen began to be cast as outlaws, monsters, and relics of a fading age. The berserker's story, which began in the mystery of frenzy and in the shadow of Odin, inevitably came into conflict with the sweeping changes brought by Christianization. The Viking Age was not only an age of raids and battles, but also a period of profound religious transformation when the old gods of Scandinavia were gradually displaced by the Christian faith. This transformation reshaped every aspect of society, from law and kingship to poetry and ritual. For the berserker, whose identity was bound so tightly to pagan practice, to altered states of devotion, and to Odin himself, the coming of Christianity was a mortal threat. In the new order, what had once been exalted as sacred became condemned as dangerous or demonic. The decline of the berserker was not sudden, but it unfolded steadily as Christian values took root, and by the high medieval period, berserkers had become figures of fear and ridicule rather than of awe. Christianity introduced a new framework for understanding human behaviour, one that was incompatible with the berserker's frenzy. Where Norse religion saw possession by Odin as divine, Christianity interpreted such states as either sinful excess or demonic influence. The howling, the shield biting, the apparent invulnerability to weapons, These were not signs of divine favour, but of possession by evil spirits. The Christian worldview had little room for the ambiguous ecstasies of Odin's warriors. The very qualities that had once been celebrated were redefined as evidence of a man's fall under the sway of the devil. This reinterpretation was not merely theological but practical. The Christian rulers and church leaders sought to build a more stable, orderly society, one in which uncontrollable frenzy was intolerable. Law codes from the Christian period reflect this shift. Where earlier laws like the Gragas had merely restricted berserk fury in peacetime, later Christian-influenced codes treated it as unlawful under any circumstances. Berserksganger was equated with outlawry, and those who entered frenzy could lose legal protections. The law no longer acknowledged a space where such behaviour might be acceptable. Instead, it marked berserkers as criminals. This reflects the changing moral order. Christianized rulers sought to centralize power, enforce peace, and suppress private violence. The berserker, once a valuable shock trooper and symbol of Odin's favour, became a disruptive force to be eliminated. Saga literature composed in the Christian period often depicts berserkers as villains. They appear as bullies who misuse their strength, as troublemakers who demand women in marriage against their will, or as mercenaries who terrorize communities. The heroes who defeat them are praised not only for strength, but for restoring order, often at feasts or in duels where berserkers had disturbed peace. These portrayals reflect the Christianized society's moral framework. The berserker became a narrative foil, a symbol of uncontrolled violence that had to be subdued by heroes who embodied restraint, justice, and Christian values. The old ambivalence of awe and fear shifted more decisively toward condemnation. At the same time, berserkers were reinterpreted through Christian demonology. Their animal transformation, once linked to Odin's power, was now likened to werewolves or other monstrous forms. Their frenzy was no longer divine ecstasy, but diabolical possession. In some sagas and folk tales, berserkers take on features of trolls or giants, monstrous opponents who embody chaos. This demonization ensured that the memory of berserkers endured, but in a form reshaped by Christianity. They were no longer sacred warriors, but reminders of the dangers of pagan practice and the wildness of the past. Despite this demonization, fascination with berserkers never disappeared. Even as they were condemned, their image retained power. Saga authors lingered on their shield-biting, their invulnerability, their terrifying howls. Christian chroniclers, while interpreting them as possessed or monstrous, still acknowledged their fearsome presence. This persistence suggests that cultural memory of berserkers was too deeply embedded to be erased. Instead, it was transformed, recast within the categories of Christian thought. What had been sacred became profane. What had been divine became diabolical, but the core image endured. The decline of berserkers also reflected broader social changes. As Scandinavian societies became more centralized under Christian kings, the need for shock troops like berserkers diminished. Warfare shifted from raiding to more organized campaigns, and the cultic dimension of frenzy no longer had a place. Professional retinues, law-based governance and church authority replaced the looser structures of the pagan age. In this context, berserkers appeared not as assets but as liabilities. Their refusal of armour, their ritual madness, their uncontrollable rage, all were out of step with the new forms of power. Their decline was therefore not only religious but political and military, part of the wider transformation of Scandinavian society. By the late medieval period, berserkers had disappeared as a living practice, surviving only in literature and folklore. The sagas preserved their memory, but always at a distance, as figures of the pagan past. Folklore carried them forward in distorted forms, sometimes as monstrous outlaws, sometimes as echoes in the image of werewolves and other shapeshifters. The demonization of their frenzy ensured that they would be remembered, but as symbols of what had been overcome. Christianity had redefined them as relics of an age of chaos, reminders of a past when men surrendered to wild gods rather than to the order of the church. Yet even in decline, the fascination with berserkers endured. Their image remained compelling, precisely because it embodied the extremes of human experience. To later audiences, they represented both the allure and the danger of unrestrained violence, the temptation of ecstasy, the thin line between human and beast. Christianization did not erase the berserker but transformed him, ensuring that his archetype would continue to haunt the imagination, not as a model to emulate but as a warning to heed. From the process of demonization, the story moves naturally into the next stage of cultural transformation, when berserkers, stripped of their sacred role, were absorbed into folklore as outlaws and monsters, figures who continue to embody violence but now on the margins of society rather than at its heart. The twilight of the berserker tradition did not mean the disappearance of its imagery. Instead, the figure that had once stood proudly in royal service or on the battlefield gradually shifted into the shadows of cultural memory, where it was reshaped by new social and religious values. In Christian Scandinavia, the berserker ceased to be a warrior in the service of Odin, or a champion in a king's retinue. Instead, he became a dangerous outlaw, or a monstrous being of folklore. The qualities that had once been seen as sacred frenzy were now retold as marks of corruption, savagery, or even supernatural evil. Through this transformation, the berserker lived on, not as a figure of admiration but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the perils of unrestrained violence and of lingering ties to the pagan world. In saga literature composed during the Christian centuries, berserkers frequently appear as antagonists. Unlike earlier depictions that sometimes presented them as loyal champions, these later accounts portray them as violent bullies who disrupt society. A recurring motif is that of the berserker gang, groups of men who travel from hall to hall, imposing themselves on local communities, demanding food, wealth, or women. They use their reputation for frenzy to intimidate others, often forcing marriages through threats of violence. In these narratives, the berserker is no longer a divine instrument but a lawless thug, his frenzy serving selfish ends rather than communal protection. The heroes who oppose them are celebrated not only for physical prowess, but for restoring social order against chaos. Examples abound across the saga tradition. In Egil's saga, berserkers challenge others to holmgang, ritual duels, in order to coerce concessions. Egil himself defeats such opponents, demonstrating not only his strength, but his superiority in honour and restraint. In Hrolf's saga Kraka, berserkers appear as both allies and adversaries, but in Christianized retellings they more often become villains, their loyalty suspect and their violence excessive. The pattern is consistent. Berserkers are increasingly depicted as outlaws who threaten the very fabric of community life. The outlaw status of berserkers in literature reflects their position in the social imagination of the time. In Christianized societies where law codes prohibited berserks ganga, those who continued to embody the old practices were cast outside the bounds of lawful society. Outlaws in Norse culture occupied a unique place. Stripped of legal protection, they could be hunted or killed without consequence, yet they also fascinated storytellers as figures who lived beyond society's constraints. The berserker, once celebrated, now joined this category. His frenzy was not a mark of divine favour, but of his exclusion from community, a reason for his removal from the lawful order. Folklore went further still, transforming berserkers into monstrous figures. Their animal associations made them easy to blend with tales of werewolves and other shapeshifters. The Ulfhednar, wolf warriors, in particular, were remembered in later stories as men who literally transformed into wolves, prowling the night in search of victims. What had once been symbolic ritual identity became literalized in Christian folklore as monstrous transformation. Similarly, the bear warrior could be recast as a troll-like being, a giant with the strength of many men and the savagery of an animal. In these tales, the berserker ceased to be human, becoming instead a creature of fear. This process of monstrous transformation was reinforced by the Christian tendency to equate pagan practices with demonic influence. The frenzy of berserkers, once interpreted as possession by Odin, was now described as possession by the devil. Their animal howls and shield biting became evidence of their inhuman nature. Their disregard for wounds was reframed not as divine protection, but as unnatural resistance granted by dark forces. In folklore, they became cautionary figures, warnings against the dangers of excess, pride, and violence. Parents might tell their children stories of berserkers not to inspire them but to frighten them into obedience. Yet even as they were demonized, berserkers remained compelling. Folklore often lingered on their invulnerability, their howls, their terrifying presence. These traits were too deeply rooted in cultural memory to be forgotten. Instead, they were reinterpreted within new frameworks. The outlaw-turned-monster was still recognizable as the berserker, even if stripped of his earlier sacred aura. The persistence of these traits shows how enduring the archetype was, how impossible it was to erase from cultural consciousness. In some stories, berserkers became blended with the figures of trolls, giants, or Draugr, the restless dead. The sagas describe Draugr as corpses animated with supernatural strength, often guarding treasures or haunting burial mounds. Their behaviour, howling, attacking with unstoppable fury, ignoring wounds, resembles that of berserkers. It is possible that cultural memory of berserkers influenced the depiction of Draugr, with the frenzy of the living warrior transferred onto the undead monster. In this way, the archetype of berserk rage continued to shape the imagination, even when the figure himself was no longer recognised as part of living society. The outlaw and monster versions of berserkers also served a didactic purpose. In Christian moral storytelling, they became examples of what happens when men surrender to violence and sin. Unlike heroes who embodied restraint, loyalty and justice, berserkers symbolised ungoverned passion. Their downfall in stories was meant to reinforce moral lessons. They were defeated by clever heroes, subdued by lawful kings, or slain as punishment for their arrogance. Each narrative reinforced the idea that berserker rage was a thing of the past, a danger rightly subdued by the new Christian order. Nevertheless, echoes of admiration persisted even in their monstrous form. The sheer power of berserkers, their fearlessness, and their willingness to face death continued to fascinate. Some folk tales portray them not simply as villains, but as tragic figures, men whose gifts became curses in a world that no longer had a place for them. Their transformation into monsters can be read as a cultural expression of ambivalence, fear and condemnation on the surface, but beneath it a lingering respect for qualities that had once been revered. The transition of berserkers into folklore demonstrates how cultural memory adapts to changing religious and social frameworks. Rather than erasing the figure entirely, Christian Scandinavia absorbed and reinterpreted him. As outlaw, he symbolised the dangers of defying law and order. As monster, he embodied the fear of pagan practices and the inhuman. Yet in both forms, the berserker survived, his archetype preserved in stories that continue to be told for generations. This transformation also laid the foundation for the later revival of berserkers in literature and popular imagination. When medieval and early modern writers looked back on the Viking Age, they often encountered the berserker not as a historical warrior but as a monstrous or outlawed figure. Romantic and nationalist movements centuries later would reinterpret him again, rescuing him from monstrosity and restoring him to heroism. But in the medieval Christian period, his fate was to dwell on the margins of society, half man and half beast, outlaw and monster, a lingering shadow of a wilder past. From the realm of folklore and fear, the story turns outward again, to explore how echoes of berserkers reached beyond Scandinavia itself, shaping impressions in Anglo-Saxon and Celtic lands, and creating parallels in neighbouring traditions that both mirrored and refracted the image of the frenzied Norse warrior. The Norse world did not exist in isolation. From the earliest days of raiding across the North Sea, Scandinavian warriors encountered the societies of Anglo-Saxon England, the Celtic kingdoms of Ireland and Scotland, and the mixed cultures that occupied the coasts and islands of the British Isles. These encounters were violent, but they also produced exchanges of stories, impressions, and cultural archetypes. The berserker, already a potent symbol within Scandinavia, did not remain confined to the sagas and laws of his homeland. His image crossed the sea, carried in the terror of raids, the memory of battles, and the reinterpretations of monks and chroniclers who struggled to describe the ferocity of Norse warriors. In Anglo-Saxon and Celtic lands, echoes of berserkers can be traced in chronicles, literature, and folklore, reshaping the archetype in ways that both reflected local traditions and reinforced the reputation of the Norse as terrifying foes. When the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 shocked the Christian world, it was not only the violence of the attack but the manner of it that left a lasting impression. Monks who witnessed or recorded the onslaught struggled to describe the savagery of warriors who seemed indifferent to wounds and who descended with sudden, overwhelming force. While the chronicles did not use the word berserker, the qualities they attributed to the raiders, recklessness, ferocity, and inhuman rage, mirror the features of berserkers in Norse tradition. To the Anglo-Saxons, the entire Viking host often appeared berserk, its violence indistinguishable from madness. The echo of the archetype was thus embedded in the very first encounters, shaping English perceptions of Norsemen for generations. As Norse raids intensified across England, Ireland, and Scotland, the image of the berserker became more distinct in the minds of those who resisted them. Anglo-Saxon poems such as the Battle of Maldon, which commemorates the clash between English defenders and Viking raiders in 991, describe Norse warriors with language that emphasises savagery, fearlessness, and a willingness to fight to the death. Though the poem does not explicitly mention berserkers, its portrayal of enemies who embody wildness and destruction echoes the qualities of berserk frenzy. The Anglo-Saxon poetic tradition, like the Norse, employed animal imagery to describe warriors, and in this imagery we see parallels that reinforce the perception of berserk-like figures among the raiders. In Celtic lands, particularly in Ireland, the impact of Norse warriors was equally profound. The Irish annals, written by monks, describe Viking attacks with horror, emphasising the cruelty and fearlessness of the invaders. These chroniclers often frame the Norse as demonic or monstrous, a framing that aligns closely with the Christian reinterpretation of berserkers in Scandinavia itself. The animalistic howls, the disregard for wounds, the sudden fury, all were understood as signs of unnatural possession. To Irish writers, the berserk qualities of Norse raiders confirmed their paganism and marked them as instruments of the devil. The archetype thus entered Irish memory not as a heroic figure but as a monstrous threat, an outsider whose savagery embodied the chaos of invasion. Yet Celtic tradition also had its own archetypes of frenzied warriors, and here the echoes of the berserker found resonance. In Irish mythology, the figure of Cuchulainn, the hero of the Ulster cycle, was famous for his riastrad, or warp spasm, a battle frenzy in which his body contorted, his strength multiplied, and he fought with uncontrollable fury until he collapsed in exhaustion. This state is strikingly similar to the Norse berserksganga, and the parallel suggests that both cultures recognised and mythologized the phenomenon of frenzied battle. When Norse raiders came to Ireland, their berserk fury may have been interpreted through the lens of these native traditions, reinforcing the association between frenzy and supernatural power. In this way, the archetype of the berserker was both foreign and familiar, a terrifying outsider and a reflection of existing myth. In Scotland and the Hebrides, where Norse settlement left deep marks, the image of berserkers blended with local folklore. Tales of warriors who fought with inhuman strength, sometimes linked to wolves or bears, circulated alongside stories of Norse raiders. In Gaelic tradition, the Fianna, bands of hunters and warriors led by the hero Fionn mac Cumhaill were remembered for their wildness and liminal existence outside settled society. Like berserkers, they occupied a space between civilization and wilderness, admired for their strength, but feared for their independence. The fusion of Norse and Gaelic traditions in these regions created a cultural landscape in which the berserker archetype could thrive, adapted to local forms while retaining its distinctive features. Anglo-Saxon and Celtic law codes also reflect the influence of berserk-like figures. In some texts, provisions exist for dealing with men who disrupt society through violence, often described in ways that echo berserk behaviour. Outlawry, exile, or death could be the punishment for such men. While not explicitly labelled berserkers, these descriptions show that the problem of uncontrollable warriors was recognised beyond Scandinavia. The echo of the berserker was thus not only literary but legal, part of the shared challenge of maintaining order in societies where warrior culture was central. Christian chroniclers across England and Ireland often recast berserker traits within biblical frameworks. The Norse invaders were described as Gog and Magog, as scourges sent by God to punish sins, as demons in human form. The howls and convulsions of berserk fury fit easily into this demonological worldview, reinforcing the sense that berserkers were not simply foreign warriors, but manifestations of evil. This interpretation, while hostile, ensured that the archetype remained vivid in memory. The berserker was absorbed into Christian eschatology, his frenzy transformed into a sign of the end times. Despite the demonization, fascination with berserkers persisted in Anglo-Saxon and Celtic lands. The fear they inspired made them larger than life, and their reputation spread in stories told long after the raids had ended. In some cases, admiration crept into the narratives, especially in later retellings that romanticised the Viking Age. The same qualities that had once been condemned, fearlessness, strength, willingness to face death, could be reinterpreted as heroic. The echoes of berserkers thus continued to shape perceptions of Norsemen, both as terrifying foes and as symbols of warrior virtue. The blending of Norse and local traditions also ensured that the archetype would endure. The warp spasm of Cuchulainn, the wildness of the Fianna, the outlaw figures of Anglo-Saxon lore, all resonated with the memory of berserkers. The result was a cultural landscape in which the berserker lived on, not as a direct transplant, but as an echo, adapted to new contexts and infused with local meaning. Across the North Sea, the archetype was reshaped but not erased, becoming part of the shared imagination of Northern Europe. These echoes also reveal the universality of the berserker phenomenon. The figure of the frenzied warrior was not unique to Scandinavia, but part of a broader pattern in which societies both admired and feared men who abandoned restraint in battle. The Norse berserker was one expression of this archetype, but his memory found resonance wherever cultures confronted the paradox of the warrior who became more than human through madness. Anglo-Saxon and Celtic traditions provided their own versions, and the encounter with Norse raiders reinforced these shared understandings. From these echoes across the sea, the story moves outward still further, to consider parallels beyond the Norse and Celtic worlds, to compare berserkers with other warrior traditions across antiquity and the medieval world, where battle frenzy appeared in different guises but with strikingly similar themes. The image of the berserker, a warrior seized by frenzy, transformed by animalistic power, and feared by friend and foe alike, may feel unique to the Norse world. Yet when placed in a wider perspective, it becomes clear that the archetype of the frenzied fighter is far older and far broader than Scandinavia. Across cultures and centuries, societies recorded the presence of warriors who seemed to cross the boundary between man and beast, who fought without fear, and who appeared possessed by forces beyond the ordinary. The Norse berserker was one striking expression of this universal theme, but echoes of his frenzy can be found from the battlefields of ancient Greece to the deserts of Arabia, from the forests of Gaul to the steppes of Central Asia. By tracing these parallels, we not only understand the berserker more fully, but glimpse the shared human fascination with the warrior who embodies both awe and terror. Among the Greeks, one of the clearest parallels lies in the figure of the Maenads, the frenzied female followers of Dionysus. Though not warriors in the conventional sense, their ecstatic states in myth and ritual mirrored the berserk's Ganga in uncanny ways. Maenads abandoned their ordinary identities, howled, danced, and tore apart animals or even men with their bare hands. Ancient authors describe them as possessed, their strength multiplied, their consciousness transformed. While male warriors in Greece did not typically take on such roles, the concept of divine possession granting superhuman power was familiar. The imagery of Dionysian frenzy resonates with the Norse idea of Odin inspiring berserker rage. In both cases, ecstasy and violence are intertwined, and the line between human and divine is blurred. In Greek epic tradition, heroes themselves sometimes entered states of rage that resemble berserk fury. The clearest example is Achilles in Homer's Iliad. After the death of Patroclus, Achilles is consumed by rage so overwhelming that it terrifies his comrades as much as it destroys his enemies. He refuses food, rejects ordinary bonds, and slaughters without mercy, desecrating Hector's body in a frenzy that surpasses human restraint. Scholars have long noted the similarity between Achilles' wrath and the berserker's frenzy. Both involve a rupture of normal limits, a transformation of the warrior into something more than human and less than civilized, a state of divine possession that overwhelms the individual. In Celtic tradition, particularly in Ireland, the warp spasm of Cuchulainn provides perhaps the closest parallel to berserk's Ganga. Descriptions of this state in the Táin Bó Cúailnge are graphic and extraordinary. Cuchulainn's body contorts, his hair stands on end, one eye bulges while the other sinks, and steam and fire burst from his head. In this condition, he slaughters enemies with inhuman strength, unstoppable until his frenzy passes. The similarities to berserkers are striking. The physical transformation, the disregard for wounds, the superhuman rage, and the eventual collapse into exhaustion. These parallels suggest that the archetype of the frenzied warrior was not confined to Norse society, but resonated across the Celtic world, perhaps reflecting a shared Indo-European heritage of warrior traditions. Among the Germanic peoples beyond Scandinavia, Roman authors recorded figures who also resembled berserkers. Tacitus, in his Germania, describes warriors who fought naked, armed only with shields, hurling themselves into battle with disregard for their lives. He emphasizes their fearlessness and their role in inspiring comrades while terrifying enemies. These warriors may have been predecessors of the berserkers, their practices preserved in altered form among the Norse centuries later. The naked warrior, indifferent to pain and clothed in the aura of divine protection, was a familiar figure in many ancient cultures. His appearance in Roman accounts of the Germanic tribes provides an important link between the broader Indo-European tradition and the later Norse berserker. The Gauls, too, were remembered for their frenzied warriors. Roman writers often emphasize the wildness of Celtic fighters, describing them as charging into battle with hair flowing, weapons clashing, and howls echoing. Some Gaulish warriors reportedly fought naked, trusting to their gods for protection. Polybius and Diodorus Siculus both note the terrifying effect of such displays, which were meant not only to intimidate enemies but to demonstrate fearlessness. The Gaulish devotion to gods of war such as Tutates and Camulus may have provided the religious foundation for these practices. The naked Gaul, fearless and frenzied, bears more than a passing resemblance to the Norse berserker. On the steppes of Central Asia, parallels can be drawn with the Scythians and later with Turkic and Mongolic traditions. The Scythians were remembered by Greek authors as fierce, animal-associated warriors who practiced ecstatic rituals. Their shamans entered trances to communicate with spirits, and their warriors were believed to channel these powers in battle. Later steppe traditions, such as the black shamans of Mongol culture, also linked martial frenzy with religious ecstasy. The image of horsemen howling into battle possessed by spirits recalls the Norse practice of invoking Odin's power through animal skins and frenzied rage. In the Near East, the Assyrian tradition of lion-hunting kings offers another dimension. Though not strictly berserkers, Assyrian kings presented themselves as possessing animal strength, capable of slaying lions with their bare hands or simple weapons. This fusion of human and animal identity staged in ritual hunts parallels the symbolic function of berserkers in Norse courts, where their animal identities reflected royal power. Across cultures, the blending of human and beast in the figure of the warrior carried deep symbolic meaning, emphasizing divine sanction and supernatural might. Further east, in India, traditions of battle frenzy appear in epic literature. In the Mahabharata, warriors enter states of divine possession, filled with overwhelming rage and strength. The hero Bhima is described as fighting with a fury that terrifies allies and enemies alike, while others are said to be possessed by gods during combat. The concept of divine ecstasy granting power in battle was thus widespread, transcending geography and culture. In the Islamic world, early Arab chronicles also speak of warriors who fought in states of overwhelming fervour, particularly in the context of religiously inspired zeal. Though different in form and purpose, the willingness to fight without fear of death, to embrace ecstasy in battle, echoes the same archetype. The berserker thus finds distant parallels even in societies shaped by very different religious traditions. These comparative examples demonstrate that the archetype of the frenzied warrior is a near-universal phenomenon. What distinguishes the Norse berserker is the particular form it took, the association with Odin, the ritual use of animal skins, the shield biting, and the specific cultural framing of frenzy as both sacred and dangerous. Yet the core elements, possession, animal identity, fearlessness, disregard for wounds, and eventual collapse, appear across many traditions. This suggests that the berserker is one expression of a deeper human pattern, rooted in the psychological and social dynamics of warfare. The universality of the archetype also helps explain why the image of berserkers resonated so strongly in encounters with other cultures. Anglo-Saxons, Celts, and even Christian chroniclers could recognise the type, even if they interpreted it differently. The frenzied warrior was familiar, even if terrifying. The Norse berserker thus joined a long lineage of figures who embodied both admiration and dread, men who seemed to cross the line between human and divine, civilization and wilderness. From these comparative traditions, the story moves naturally into the psychological dimension, for if warriors across cultures entered similar frenzies, it suggests that the roots of berserk rage lie not only in ritual or myth, but in the human mind itself, in states of trance, altered consciousness, and the profound transformation that battle can induce. The image of the berserker has long inspired awe, curiosity, and fear, but beyond the myths, sagas, and cultural frameworks lies another layer of explanation: the psychology of frenzy itself. For all their religious associations with Odin, their ritual trappings, and their animal symbolism, berserkers were still men, subject to the workings of the human mind and body. To understand their transformation from ordinary warriors into raging figures who seemed impervious to pain and reason, we must consider what modern psychology, neuroscience, and anthropology can reveal about altered states of consciousness, rage, and trance. Through this lens, the berserker becomes not only a cultural archetype, but also a human phenomenon, one rooted in the extremes of emotion, physiology, and ritual conditioning. At the heart of berserk fury lies the phenomenon of rage. Rage is among the most primal of human emotions, a state in which the body floods with adrenaline, the senses sharpen, and rational restraint diminishes. In everyday life, rage is dangerous and socially disruptive, but in the context of battle, it can provide temporary advantages. Berserkers, however, appear to have cultivated rage deliberately, pushing it to an extreme that bordered on trance. The sagas describe their howls, their convulsions, their shield biting, and their seeming indifference to wounds. These details suggest a state not of ordinary anger, but of altered consciousness, where the self was consumed by an overwhelming emotional and physiological storm. Modern psychology recognizes that extreme emotional states can produce dissociation, a condition in which normal awareness of self and surroundings becomes fragmented. In dissociation, individuals may experience reduced sensation of pain, narrowed focus, or a sense of detachment from their bodies. Berserker rage may well have been a culturally framed form of dissociation, induced through ritual, belief, and social expectation. If a warrior believed that Odin had possessed him, and if he performed the expected behaviours of frenzy, howling, biting, charging, he could enter a state in which the boundaries of self dissolved, leaving only the overwhelming drive to fight. The physiological dimension of berserk fury is equally striking. Accounts emphasize their indifference to wounds, suggesting that their bodies were flooded with endorphins and adrenaline, natural chemicals that dull pain and heighten strength in moments of crisis. Modern soldiers and athletes sometimes report similar experiences, a temporary state in which exhaustion and pain vanish, replaced by clarity and energy. The berserkers, however, cultivated this response to an extreme, likely through ritual preparation. Fasting, drumming, chanting, and the donning of animal skins may have primed their bodies and minds for the surge of battle, transforming natural stress responses into something extraordinary. Trance states offer another key to understanding berserkers. Anthropologists have documented rituals around the world in which participants enter altered states of consciousness through rhythmic movement, chanting, or sensory overload. Shamans in Siberia, dancers in African possession cults, and practitioners of Siddha in Norse society all demonstrate that trance was a familiar and powerful human experience. Berserkers likely drew upon similar techniques. Their howling and rhythmic movements, their animal identification, and their rituals of preparation could all induce trance, enabling them to transcend ordinary consciousness. In this state, they became the wolves or bears they imitated, losing themselves in the identity of the animal and in the possession of Odin. The psychological experience of transformation into an animal, what some anthropologists call shape-shifting trance, provides a further explanation for berserker behaviour. When a warrior believed he had become a wolf or bear, his actions followed the logic of that belief. He would howl, bite, fight with disregard for human norms. His strength might seem greater because he no longer restrained himself as a man, but fought as an imagined beast. The loss of self, the adoption of an animal identity, and the surge of rage combined into a powerful cocktail that terrified enemies and inspired allies. There is also evidence to suggest that psychoactive substances may have played a role. Some scholars have proposed that berserkers used hallucinogenic mushrooms, such as Amanita muscaria, to induce frenzy. Others have suggested alcohol or herbal preparations. While the evidence is inconclusive, it is possible that substances enhance their psychological and physiological state. Combined with ritual and belief, such substances could have tipped warriors into trance, amplifying rage into ecstasy. However, the consistency of berserker behaviour across sources suggests that even without drugs, cultural conditioning and psychological techniques were sufficient to induce the frenzy. From a psychological perspective, the social context of berserkers is also critical. These were not isolated madmen, but warriors embedded in communities that valued and expected their frenzy. The saga accounts, laws, and poetry all confirm that society recognized berserkers as a distinct type, with roles and expectations. This cultural framing created a feedback loop. The warrior who identified as a berserker believed he should enter frenzy, and his community expected it. In battle, the performance of frenzy became reality, reinforced by adrenaline, trance, and belief. The social dimension of psychology, what anthropologists call cultural scripts, thus played a central role in shaping berserk fury. The aftermath of frenzy also fits within psychological patterns. Sagas often describe berserkers collapsing after their rage subsided, drained of strength, vulnerable, and sometimes ashamed. This parallels the post-adrenaline crash observed in modern contexts when the body, after prolonged stress, experiences exhaustion and depletion. The cycle of frenzy, battle, and collapse suggests that berserker states were not sustainable for long, but burned intensely before fading. This pattern reinforces the idea that berserkers entered genuine altered states, not merely feigned madness. The psychological lens also helps explain why berserkers inspired both awe and terror. To outsiders, their behaviour was uncanny, a rupture of normal human boundaries. They seemed possessed, inhuman, unstoppable. This perception magnified their effectiveness in battle, for fear is as powerful a weapon as steel, but to their own communities the same traits were double-edged. Outside the battlefield, frenzy was disruptive, uncontrollable, and dangerous. This explains the laws that restricted Berserksganger in peacetime, and the sagas that depict berserkers as both champions and villains. The psychological phenomenon was real, but its social interpretation determined whether it was admired or condemned. Modern neuroscience provides further insight into the berserker state. Extreme stress can activate the amygdala, the brain's centre for fear and aggression, while suppressing the prefrontal cortex, which governs rational thought. In such states, individuals may act with reckless violence, their behaviour driven by primal impulses rather than reason. Endorphins and adrenaline dull pain, while dopamine provides a sense of exhilaration. This neurochemical storm resembles descriptions of berserker rage. In essence, berserkers may have harnessed the body's natural fight-or-flight mechanisms, amplifying them through ritual, belief, and cultural identity until they reached levels of frenzy beyond the ordinary. The psychological interpretation does not diminish the cultural and religious dimensions of berserkers, but complements them. To the Norse, the frenzy was Odin's gift, a sign of divine possession. To modern psychology, it was a form of trance, rage, and dissociation, shaped by ritual and belief. Both explanations describe the same phenomenon from different angles. Together, they reveal the berserker as a profoundly human figure, embodying the capacity of the mind and body to transcend ordinary limits under extraordinary circumstances. Understanding berserkers through psychology also clarifies their universality. From Achilles' wrath to Cuchulain's warp spasm, from Scythian shamans to modern soldiers who describe battle as surreal or ecstatic, the experience of altered states in combat recurs across cultures. The berserker was the Norse expression of a human potential that surfaces wherever violence and ritual combine. By examining the psychology of rage and trance, we see not only why berserkers existed, but why they resonate still, their archetypes speaking to something deep within the human condition. From the psychological dimensions of frenzy, the story now turns to the tangible traces berserkers left behind: graves, carvings, amulets, and stones, through which archaeology seeks to uncover evidence of men who lived at the boundary between history and myth. The berserker is remembered vividly in sagas, poems, and chronicles, but if we turn from words to the physical remains of the Viking Age, the picture becomes more elusive. Archaeology offers fragments of evidence, carvings on stones, images on small metal plaques, burial goods, and traces of ritual that hint at the existence of warriors who embodied the frenzy of animal identity and divine possession. Yet, the record is not straightforward. Material culture rarely speaks in the clear language of sagas, and interpreting the remains requires caution. Still, when taken together, graves, stones, and icons provide glimpses of the berserker's world, revealing how deeply their image was woven into the symbolic fabric of Norse society. One of the most compelling pieces of archaeological evidence comes from the Torslunda plates, discovered on the island of Öland in Sweden. These small stamped foils, dating from the 6th or 7th century, depict scenes of warriors and gods. One famous image shows a one-eyed figure, interpreted as Odin, standing beside a dancer or warrior wearing an animal mask, often identified as a wolf or bear. The masked figure appears in motion, perhaps leaping or performing a ritual gesture, while the god looks on. Scholars interpret this scene as a representation of ritual initiation, where a warrior dons the identity of an animal and receives Odin's blessing. The Torslunda plates thus provide visual confirmation of practices that the sagas describe. The connection between Odin, animal transformation, and the frenzied warrior. Picture stones and rune stones from Scandinavia also preserve imagery suggestive of berserkers. On some stones, warriors are depicted in animal skins, their bodies exaggerated, their gestures fierce. Though runic inscriptions rarely mention berserkers explicitly, the iconography aligns with their archetype. The Storhamar stones from Gotland, for example, include images of armed men in ritual contexts, some of whom appear to wear animal disguises. These images blur the line between myth and reality, suggesting that the identity of animal warriors was not only a battlefield phenomenon but part of religious or ceremonial performance. Small amulets and figurines provide further clues. Miniature figures found in graves and hoards sometimes depict men wearing animal heads or masks. These could have been worn as charms, invoking the protection or power of the animal spirit. One silver figurine from the 10th century, often called the Odin figure from Læsø in Denmark, shows a seated figure flanked by animals, perhaps wolves. Though not a direct depiction of a berserker, it reinforces the symbolic link between Odin, animals, and warriors. Such items may have been carried by berserkers themselves, or by those who sought their protection. Burial evidence is more ambiguous, but still revealing. Some warrior graves include animal skins, particularly bear and wolf pelts, alongside weapons. In certain elite burials, masks or helmets with animal motifs suggest an identity that fused human and beast. The famous Vendel and Valsgärde graves in Sweden, predating the Viking Age but part of the same cultural continuum, contain helmets with boar and bird imagery, emphasizing transformation and animal power. While we cannot say with certainty that these belong to berserkers, they demonstrate that the idea of the animal warrior was deeply embedded in elite martial culture. Weapons themselves may also reflect berserker identity. The double-headed axes, heavy swords, and round shields found in graves were not unique to berserkers, but their presence in richly furnished burials of warriors suggests the high status of those who lived by martial prowess. Some shields bear traces of biting, though whether this was from ritual performance or later damage is debated. Still, the saga descriptions of shield biting find intriguing, if circumstantial, support in the archaeological record. The absence of direct inscriptions naming berserkers is itself significant. Runestones commemorate many warriors, kings, and voyages, but they rarely, if ever, use the word berserker. This silence may reflect the ambivalence surrounding their identity. While admired in poetry, berserkers may have been too liminal, too associated with frenzy and danger, to be celebrated openly in public monuments. Instead, their image was preserved in more symbolic forms, in masks, animal skins, and ritual scenes, where their archetype could be invoked without being named. Archaeology also reveals the broader ritual context that framed berserker identity. Sites of sacrifice, where animals and sometimes humans were offered to the gods, suggest ceremonies that paralleled the initiation of frenzied warriors. The deposition of weapons in bogs, a practice common across Scandinavia, may have reflected offerings connected to warrior cults. Berserkers, who embodied the link between man and animal, warrior and god, likely participated in such rites, their frenzy not confined to battle, but integrated into the sacred rhythms of society. Even outside Scandinavia, material culture provides echoes of berserkers. In England, carved stones from the Danelaw regions show Norse warriors in battle scenes, sometimes accompanied by animals. In Ireland and Scotland, Norse art blended with local styles to produce images of warriors that may have carried associations of frenzy. these cross-cultural artifacts suggest that the image of the berserker travelled with raiders and settlers, leaving its mark wherever Norse influence spread. Skeptics caution that much of the archaeological evidence is open to interpretation. A mask or pelt in a grave could be symbolic without signifying a berserker. An animal-headed figure on a plate could represent a myth rather than a living warrior. Yet the consistency of the imagery, animal transformation, divine oversight, ritual gesture, makes it difficult to dismiss. Combined with the literary sources, the artifacts point strongly toward the existence of a warrior type who identified with animals, entered frenzy, and was linked to Odin. The challenge of interpreting the evidence mirrors the ambiguity of berserkers themselves. They stood at the boundary of law and outlawry, admiration and fear, myth and reality. Archaeology captures this same ambiguity, offering hints rather than certainties, images rather than names. But these fragments are enough to confirm that berserkers were not purely literary inventions. Their identity was grounded in real practices, real rituals and real symbols, preserved in metal, stone, and bone. The material traces also highlight the continuity of the archetype. From the Vendel helmets to the Viking picture stones, from amulets of animal-headed men to graves lined with pelts, the theme of transformation, frenzy, and divine possession persisted across centuries. The berserker was not an invention of later saga authors, but a figure deeply rooted in Scandinavian culture, visible both in words and in artifacts. From the world of archaeology, with its stones and icons, the story moves forward into later centuries, when the berserker, though no longer a living warrior, was revived in literature, nationalism and fantasy, his image reshaped to fit the dreams and fears of new generations. By the time the Middle Ages gave way to the modern era, berserkers had long since vanished from the battlefields of Scandinavia. Their frenzy, once celebrated in the service of Odin and feared in the sagas, survived mostly in the shadows of folklore and in the hostile descriptions of Christian chroniclers. Yet the archetype never disappeared entirely. It remained dormant in cultural memory, waiting for the right historical moment to be reawakened. That moment came in the 18th and 19th centuries during the Romantic era, when Europe turned its gaze toward the past with renewed fascination. In this new cultural climate, the berserker was not only remembered but revived, transformed into a figure of literary inspiration, national identity, and eventually modern fantasy. The Romantic movement was born in reaction to the rationalism of the Enlightenment. Where the Enlightenment had emphasized reason, order, and universal truths, Romanticism celebrated emotion, individuality, and the wild power of nature. Ancient myths and medieval legends, once dismissed as superstition, were rediscovered as sources of authenticity and inspiration. In this context, the berserker fit perfectly. He embodied passion over reason, nature over civilization, wildness over restraint. To Romantic writers, he was not a villain of chaotic violence but a symbol of primal vitality, a living connection to the raw energies of the past. In Scandinavia, this revival was tied closely to the rise of nationalism. During the 19th century, as nations like Norway, Sweden and Denmark sought to assert their identities in the face of political change, their intellectuals turned to the Viking Age as a golden heritage. The berserker, once condemned by Christian moralists, was reimagined as part of that heroic past. In literature, art and scholarship, he was depicted as a warrior of unmatched courage, a man who embodied the spirit of the North. Far from being an outlaw or monster, he was reclaimed as an ancestor to be proud of. The sagas, many of which had been preserved in Iceland, were central to this revival. Scholars and translators brought them to wider audiences, and Romantic readers devoured their tales of warriors and gods. Berserkers featured prominently in these texts, and their wildness, once troubling, became a source of fascination. Painters depicted them as muscular heroes clad in animal skins, their eyes blazing with frenzy, their axes raised high. Poets celebrated them as symbols of unbroken strength, untainted by the corruption of modern society. In this new vision, the berserker was no longer an object of fear but an icon of national vigour. This reimagining was not confined to Scandinavia. Across Europe, the Viking Age captured the romantic imagination. In Germany, Britain, and beyond, poets and novelists drew upon Norse themes, incorporating berserkers into their works. The wild warrior who fought with unrestrained passion appealed to a generation fascinated by the sublime and the primal. Writers used berserkers as characters who embodied authenticity, men who lived closer to nature and to truth than the polished aristocrats of the modern world. The Romantic Revival also influenced scholarship. Antiquarians and early historians, eager to celebrate the Viking past, often interpreted archaeological finds through the lens of berserker imagery. A helmet decorated with animal motifs became proof of berserk identity. A burial with a pelt suggested ritual transformation. While not always accurate, these interpretations reinforced the idea that berserkers were central to Norse culture, providing a scholarly foundation for their romanticized image. In literature, the berserker archetype was particularly influential. 19th century poets such as Esaias Tegnér in Sweden and later novelists across Europe wrote of Viking warriors whose frenzy embodied both national spirit and romantic passion. In Britain, the berserker figure influenced Victorian poetry and historical fiction, where he was often depicted as a noble savage, a warrior unspoiled by the compromises of civilization. This literary revival ensured that the berserker became not only a Scandinavian figure, but part of a broader European cultural landscape. The transformation continued into the 20th century, when the berserker archetype entered the realm of modern fantasy. Writers like William Morris and later J.R.R. Tolkien drew heavily on Norse mythology and saga literature. While Tolkien did not depict berserkers directly, his characters, such as Bjorn, the shapeshifter who takes the form of a bear, echo the animal identities of berserk warriors. The imagery of men transforming into beasts, fighting with overwhelming rage and living on the margins of society, resonated deeply with modern fantasy, where the berserker became a recurring type. In role-playing games, novels, and later video games, the berserker found new life as a character class defined by rage and ferocity. Stripped of its historical ambiguity, the modern fantasy berserker is often a heroic figure, admired for his strength and feared for his uncontrollable power. This version of the archetype, though simplified, owes its existence to the Romantic Revival, which transformed the outlaw and monster of medieval folklore into a symbol of vitality and freedom. Nationalism also continued to draw upon the berserker. In the early 20th century, as nations faced wars and upheavals, the image of the frenzied Norse warrior was sometimes invoked in propaganda and cultural rhetoric. His fearlessness and refusal to yield were celebrated as virtues of the nation. At times, this imagery was distorted for darker purposes, co-opted by ideologies that sought to glorify violence and racial purity. The berserker, as a symbol, proved malleable, capable of being admired, romanticized, or exploited according to the needs of the moment. Artistic depictions of berserkers also flourished. Painters of the 19th century produced dramatic scenes of warriors clad in pelts, charging into battle or collapsing in exhaustion after frenzy. Sculptors carved their images into monuments that celebrated the Viking past. These works reinforced the romantic image of the berserker as both terrifying and beautiful, a figure who embodied the sublime mixture of awe and dread. The Romantic Revival did not simply restore the berserker, it reshaped him. The medieval outlaw became a national hero. The monstrous figure of folklore became a symbol of vitality. The frenzied warrior, once feared by Christians, became admired by modern readers as a man who lived authentically, unrestrained by the compromises of civilization. This transformation reveals as much about the values of the Romantic era as it does about the berserkers themselves. They were remade to fit the needs of a world seeking authenticity in the past, inspiration in myth, and identity in national heritage. From the Romantic Revival, the berserker entered the bloodstream of modern culture. His image persisted in literature, art, scholarship, and fantasy, shaping not only how we remember the Viking Age, but how we imagine the archetype of the frenzied warrior across time. The revival ensured that the berserker would never be forgotten, not as a shadowy outlaw but as a central symbol of the North, a figure reborn in the imagination of nations and storytellers alike. From this romantic and modern reinterpretation, the story continues into the present, where the berserker archetype still casts a shadow, reappearing in popular culture, gaming, and cinema, but also surviving as a psychological and cultural symbol of human fascination with the extremes of rage, power, and transformation. The figure of the berserker, born in the warrior cults of pagan Scandinavia, tempered in the sagas, demonized under Christianization, reshaped in folklore, and revived during the Romantic era, has never faded entirely from cultural memory. His frenzy, his animal identity, and his unnerving combination of awe and terror continue to echo across centuries. Though the historical practice of berserksganga vanished long ago, the archetype of the frenzied warrior has endured, resurfacing in literature, art, psychology, and popular culture. The berserker remains a shadow that lingers at the edges of human imagination, a reminder of the fascination and fear inspired by those who abandon restraint and become something more and less than human. The endurance of the berserker archetype speaks to its deep resonance with universal human themes. At its core lies the tension between control and chaos, civilization and wilderness, human and beast. The berserker embodies the possibility of crossing the boundary that normally separates order from disorder, reason from madness. Societies across time have both admired and condemned this crossing. In the Viking Age, it was sanctified through Odin's cult. In the Christian Middle Ages, it was demonized. In Romantic nationalism, it was celebrated again. In modern fantasy, it is commodified as a character type. At every stage, the berserker has served as a mirror for cultural values, reflecting what societies feared, admired, or longed for in their own warriors. The legacy of berserkers is visible in modern language. The word berserk itself has entered many tongues, detached from its original cultural roots, but still carrying the sense of uncontrollable frenzy. To go berserk today means to lose control, to rage wildly, to act with violent abandon. This linguistic survival demonstrates how deeply the archetype has embedded itself in cultural consciousness. Even those who know little of Norse mythology invoke the memory of berserkers whenever they use the term. In literature, the berserker archetype continues to appear in varied forms. From the Romantic poets to modern novelists, the image of the frenzied warrior remains compelling. Historical fiction set in the Viking Age often includes berserkers as dramatic figures, their frenzy providing both spectacle and authenticity. Fantasy literature, drawing heavily on Norse mythology, makes frequent use of berserkers, portraying them as character classes defined by rage and strength. In these depictions, the ancient archetype is adapted to new contexts, but the essence remains: the warrior who channels fury into overwhelming power, often at the cost of control. Cinema has also embraced the berserker. Viking-themed films frequently feature berserker characters clad in animal skins, charging into battle with howls and wide-eyed fury. Even outside explicitly Norse settings, the archetype surfaces in films that depict warriors who fight with reckless abandon, who terrify enemies not only with weapons but with their loss of restraint. The berserker's image has become part of the global vocabulary of storytelling, a shorthand for the wild warrior who transcends normal limits. In gaming, the berserker archetype is especially prominent. Role-playing games, both tabletop and digital, often include berserker or barbarian classes defined by rage mechanics. Players channel fury to increase strength, ignore pain, and fight with relentless aggression. These mechanics, though simplified, reflect the same traits described in the sagas: heightened power, invulnerability, and eventual exhaustion. Through gaming, the Berserker has become one of the most recognisable archetypes in modern fantasy, ensuring that his image reaches new generations worldwide. The persistence of the Berserker archetype is not limited to entertainment. Psychologists and historians have studied Berserkers as examples of altered states of consciousness, exploring what their frenzy reveals about human potential and limits. Some view them as early case studies in dissociation, trance, or collective ritual performance. Others see them as symbols of the human capacity to transcend fear, to embrace death, and to channel primal forces in the service of survival. In this sense, the Berserker remains relevant not only as myth, but as a window into the workings of the human mind under extreme conditions. The archetype also carries ethical and cultural weight in the modern world. In an age that often seeks balance, restraint, and order, the Berserker serves as a reminder of the dangers of ungoverned passion, yet he also embodies the allure of freedom from restraint, the thrill of surrendering to raw instinct. Modern culture continues to wrestle with this duality. Heroes who embody Berserk traits, whether in literature, film, or games, are admired for their strength, but feared for their volatility. The archetype continues to challenge audiences to reflect on their own relationship with power, rage, and control. Nationalist movements, though less central today, once again provide a cautionary example of the Berserker's enduring power. In the 20th century, some ideologies co-opted Norse imagery, including Berserkers, to glorify violence and to construct myths of racial superiority. This distortion of the archetype demonstrates how potent it can be, capable of inspiring both artistic creativity and destructive political fantasies. The Berserker's legacy, like his frenzy, is double-edged. It can inspire admiration, but it can also be twisted to justify chaos and cruelty. At a deeper level, the eternal legacy of the Berserker lies in his symbolic universality. Every culture has confronted the paradox of the frenzied warrior, the figure who abandons reason and becomes terrifyingly effective. From Achilles in Greece to Cuchulainn in Ireland, from Scythian shamans to modern soldiers who speak of battle high, the archetype appears again and again. The Norse Berserker is one version of this broader human pattern, and his survival in modern memory reflects the enduring fascination with this extreme of the warrior experience. The Berserker also lingers in contemporary subcultures. Modern groups dedicated to Viking reenactment, neo-pagan practice, or martial arts sometimes seek to reconstruct Berserker traditions, whether through ritual, roleplay, or combat sports. Though these reconstructions are speculative, they reflect the continuing allure of the archetype. To don the bear skin or howl like a wolf is to step into the shadow of the Berserker, to reenact the transformation that so fascinated past societies. Even if the historical accuracy is uncertain, the symbolic power remains strong. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Berserker is his role as a symbol of transformation. He represents the possibility of becoming something beyond the ordinary, of crossing into a state where pain, fear, and restraint fall away. For the Norse, this transformation was divine, a gift of Odin. For later societies, it was demonic or monstrous. For modern audiences, it is often heroic or cathartic. Across all these interpretations, the essence remains. The Berserker is a figure of becoming, of leaving behind ordinary humanity to embody something greater, wilder, and more dangerous. The shadow of the Berserker thus stretches across history, culture, and imagination. He's not confined to the Viking age, but remains with us, reshaped to fit the values and fears of each era. His frenzy still fascinates, his animal identity still inspires, his duality of awe and terror still unsettles. Though the men who once howled on the battlefields of Scandinavia are long gone, their archetype endures, a reminder of the extremes of human experience and the thin line between control and chaos. From this legacy, the story continues into the wider reflections of what the Berserker archetype means today, how it is used, remembered, and reinterpreted in ways that ensure it will never disappear, but will always remain a shadow in the imagination of the human world.